Tonight, let us travel together to a quiet bend in a river, in a land of low green hills and warm yellow light, in a time so long ago that the city it would become had not yet been dreamed. There's nothing here you need to hold on to, no task that cannot keep until the morning. You can let the words settle over you like the soft dust of a summer evening, and let yourself drift down, slowly and gently, towards sleep. This is the story of the founding of Rome and of the 7 hills upon which it grew. Picture, if you will, the central part of the long boot-shaped peninsula we now call Italy, in a time before nearly all of the history you may have heard of. A river winds through this country, broad and brown and slow, moving down from the mountains toward the sea. The people of a later age would call it the Tiber. Along its banks, the land rises into a cluster of low hills, rounded and gentle, their slopes covered in oak and chestnut and the silver gray of olive trees. Between the hills lie marshy valleys, soft underfoot, where reeds grow thick and the air hums with insects in the warmth of the afternoon. It is here on these hills above the river that one of the greatest cities the world has ever known would one day rise. But on the evening we are imagining, there is no city. There are only the hills and the river and the wide quiet sky and a few scattered villages of round thatched huts whose smoke drifts up into the gold of the setting sun. Let us begin with the hills themselves, for the Romans never forgot them, and they named them with a kind of reverence that lasted as long as the city did. There were 7, the Palatine, the Capitoline, the Aventine, the Caelian, the Esquiline, the Viminal, and the Quirinal. These names would echo down through thousands of years of history, and even now, long after, a traveler can stand upon them. They are not tall hills. None of them rises very high above the valleys around them. But in the flat country along the river, they stood out clearly, dry and defensible above the marshes, catching the breeze, looking down upon the bend of the Tiber where the river could be crossed. Let us name them again slowly the way the Romans cherished them, for there is a quiet pleasure in old names. The Capitoline, smallest and steepest of the 7, would become the sacred citadel of Rome, crowned with the greatest of its temples, the holy heart of the city. The Aventine, set a little apart, would long be the hill of the common people. The Caelian and the Esquiline would fill in time with the houses of the rich, their gardens and their painted villas spreading over the slopes. The Viminal and the Quirinal to the north would gather their own crowds of dwellings, and the Palatine in the center, broad and proud, would become the hill of kings and emperors, until its very name, and tongue after tongue, became the word for palace. But all of that lay ahead. In the beginning they were only hills, green and quiet, with the smoke of small villages rising from their crowns. Of all the 7, one was first in the hearts of the Romans and first in their story, the Palatine. The Palatine is a broad, flat-topped hill near the center of the cluster, with steep sides and a wide green summit. From its crown you can see the river below and the other hills around, and in the earliest days it caught the morning sun and held the evening warmth. The Romans believed that this was where their city began, and the archaeology agrees with them more closely than you might expect. Diggers working on the slopes of the Palatine have found the post holes of small oval huts, dating back nearly 3,000 years, the homes of shepherds and farmers who lived on the hilltop long before there was anything that could be called Rome. They kept their sheep on the slopes and grew their grain in the valleys, and at night they gathered their flocks within simple wooden fences and watched the stars wheel slowly over the river. Out of these humble villages, over many slow generations, the city would grow. But the Romans did not tell their origin as a story of villages slowly joining. They told it as a story, a vivid and memorable story, and it is a story worth hearing as you drift towards sleep, for it is one of the oldest and most famous tales in the world. Let us tell it the way they told it. Long ago, the Romans said, in a city called Alba Longa not far from these hills, there ruled a king who was wrongly cast down from his throne by his own brother. The rightful king had a daughter, and the brother who had seized power feared that her children might one day grow up to challenge him and take back what had been stolen. And so he made her a priestess, sworn to have no children at all. But the story tells that the god Mars, the god of war, came to her, and she bore twin sons, 2 boys, strong and crying in the dark. When the false king learned of the twins, he was afraid, and he ordered them taken away and drowned in the river Tiber. The servant given this cruel task could not bring himself to do it. Instead, he set the 2 infants in a basket and laid the basket upon the water and let the river carry them where it would. The Tiber was high with the floods of spring, and it bore the basket gently along past the marshes and the reeds, until at last it came to rest at the foot of one of the 7 hills, where the water had spread out over the low ground and then slowly drawn back. There, the story tells, the 2 babies lay crying among the roots of a wild fig tree, and there a she-wolf coming down to the river to drink heard them. She did not harm them. Instead, she gathered them to her and let them feed and kept them warm, and so the twins survived. A woodpecker, a bird sacred to Mars, brought them food as well. And in time, a herdsman of those hills, a simple shepherd, found the children in the care of the wolf, and he took them home, and he and his wife raised them as their own among the flocks on the slopes of the Palatine. The boys were named Romulus and Remus, and they grew up strong and bold, the way heroes do in old stories, leaders among the young men of the hills, until at last they learned the secret of their birth. When they were grown, the brothers resolved to build a city of their own, in the very place where the river had set them down as infants and the wolf had saved them. But here the story turns, as the oldest stories so often do, toward sorrow, for the 2 brothers could not agree on which hill the city should stand, nor whose name it should bear. Romulus favored the Palatine, Remus favored the Aventine nearby. They decided to settle the matter by watching the sky for signs from the gods, an omen carried by birds. Remus on the Aventine saw 6 birds, but Romulus on the Palatine saw 12. And so it was decided, though the brothers quarreled even over the counting, that Romulus should be the founder, and that the city should rise upon the Palatine, and that it should bear his name, Rome. Romulus marked out the boundary of his new city, the sacred line of its walls, with a plow drawn in a great circle around the hill. This furrow was holy, it was forbidden to cross it, and here the story reaches its hard and famous end, for Remus, in scorn or in grief, leapt over the line his brother had drawn, and Romulus, in anger, struck him down. The founding of the city was sealed in the blood of a brother, and the Romans, who were an unflinching people, never softened this part of the tale. They told it plainly as a thing that had happened, and they remembered that their city was born of both love and violence at once. The date they assigned to this founding, counting backward through their long memory, fell in a year we would call the middle of the 8th century before the Common Era. The Romans reckoned their own calendar from it, counting the years from the founding of the city. To them, time itself began on the Palatine. It is worth pausing over how much this single story meant to the Romans, for they carried it with them through the whole of their long history, and it shaped how they saw themselves. The she-wolf who suckled the twins became one of the great emblems of Rome, her image cast in bronze and set up in the city, stamped upon coins, carved upon monuments, repeated down through the centuries until it became inseparable from the idea of Rome itself. To this day, the wolf with the 2 children beneath her is a symbol known across the world. In the figure of Romulus, the founder, the first king, the man who drew the sacred furrow and gave the city its name, stood at the head of all Roman history, the beginning from which everything else flowed. The Romans loved this story not because it was gentle, for it was not, but because it told them truths about themselves that they believed. It told them they were children of the god of war, a martial people born to fight and to conquer. It told them they had been saved and nourished by the wild land itself, by the river and the wolf, as though nature had chosen them. It told them that their city was founded with solemn ritual, with the sacred plow and the watching of the heavens, so that Rome was holy from its first day. And it told them in the death of Remus that the city had been bought with a price, with blood and sorrow, and that greatness was never without its cost. The Romans were a people who did not flinch from hard truths, and they wove the hardest truths into the very story of their birth. There is a deeper thing in it, too. Whether or not there was ever real Romulus, whether or not the wolf ever came down to the river, the story holds a kind of truth about how the city actually began, out of small and humble and even harsh beginnings, abandoned and yet surviving, nourished by the wild land along the river, growing strong against all expectation. A foundling city, you might say, set adrift and washed ashore, and somehow, against all odds, living and growing and becoming great. There is something in that which speaks to anyone who has ever started from little and built toward much, and perhaps that is part of why the story has lasted so long, and traveled so far, and still has the power to move us, all these thousands of years later. Now let us step back from the legend and stand for a moment in the early village, in the centuries after the founding, when Rome was small and young and still finding its shape. Imagine the Palatine in those first generations. On its summit stand huts of timber and thatch and daub, round or oval, their roofs steep to shed the rain, smoke rising through holes at their peaks. Among them, the Romans kept a special hut, rebuilt again and again over the centuries, which they called the House of Romulus, a simple shepherd's dwelling preserved as a sacred relic of their beginnings. Even when Rome had become the mistress of the world, with marble palaces crowning that same hill, they kept that little hut of straw and timber and tended it carefully, so that the greatest city on earth would never forget that it had begun as the home of a herdsman. Below the Palatine lay a marshy valley between the hills, soft and wet and prone to flooding. In time the Romans would drain it, channeling the water away through a great covered drain, and the dried valley floor would become the heart of their city, the Forum, the meeting place of the Roman world. But in these early days it was still a damp hollow where the streams gathered, and the people of the separate hilltop villages would come down to its edges to trade and to bury their dead, and slowly to learn to think of themselves as one people. This was the true founding, the slow one, the one beneath the legend. The villages of the Seven Hills, each on its own height, gradually grew together. They shared the river crossing, which was precious, for whoever held the ford held the trade that moved along the Tiber and the road that ran beside it. They shared their markets and their festivals and their gods. And bit by bit, over generations, the separate settlements became a single city, walled and proud, looking out from its hills over the river and the plain. The Romans were ruled in these early centuries by kings, 7 of them in their tradition, beginning with Romulus himself. These early kings were figures half in history and half in legend, and the stories told of them are stories of a city learning what it would become. One king was said to have given Rome its religion and its calendar, a peaceful and pious ruler. Another built the great drain that emptied the marsh and raised the first stone bridge across the Tiber. Another laid out the boundaries of the city and built a wall around all 7 hills, gathering them at last into one. Whether these men lived exactly as the stories say we cannot know, but the shape of what they did is true enough. Rome grew, it organized itself. It bound its hills together and turned its marsh into a meeting place and its ford into a gateway for the trade of central Italy. Let us linger a while longer in that early world, for it is a peaceful thing to imagine, the slow growing of a city out of the green hills. Think of the people who lived there in those first centuries, not the heroes of legend, but the ordinary men and women whose names are wholly forgotten, the farmers and herders and potters and weavers who made up the true life of the place. They rose with the sun and worked through the day in the fields and pastures along the river, tending their grain and their vines and their olive trees, watching over their flocks on the slopes. The land was good to them, generous in a quiet way, giving them enough to live on and a little to spare. They built their houses of timber and clay and thatch, simple and snug, with a hearth in the middle where the fire burned and the family gathered in the evening. They made their pots by hand and wove their cloth on simple looms, and fashioned their tools from wood and bronze, and in time from iron. Theirs was a small world, bounded by the hills they could see and the river they lived beside, but it was a whole world to them, and they filled it with the ordinary business of living. And they were a religious people from the very beginning, these early Romans, in a way that shaped everything they did. They felt themselves surrounded by powers and spirits, in the river, in the woods, in the fields, in the doorway of the house and the hearth at its center, in the storehouse where the grain was kept. Every place had its spirit, every act its proper ritual, every household its small gods who watched over it. The farmer would not begin the harvest, nor the family sit down to its meal, nor any work of importance be undertaken, without first offering some small observance to the powers that governed it. This deep and careful piety, this sense that the world was alive with spirits who must be honored and kept content, was woven into the Roman character from these earliest days, and it would remain with them, in one form or another, through all the long centuries to come, even when their little hilltop village had become the mistress of the world. The neighbors of the early Romans were many, for central Italy in those days was a patchwork of peoples. To the north dwelt the Etruscans, a rich and gifted people, skilled in metalwork and art and the reading of omens, whose cities were grander and older than Rome, and whose influence upon the young city was great. From the Etruscans, the Romans learned much in their early days of building and of craft and of the arts of civilization, and several of the legendary kings of Rome were said to have come from among them. To the south and east lay other peoples, other tribes, some friendly and some hostile, with whom the Romans traded and quarreled and made war and married, in the endless small dealings of neighboring peoples. Out of all this mingling, the Romans took what they found useful and made it their own, for this was their genius from the start, not to invent everything themselves, but to borrow wisely, to absorb and adapt and improve upon what others had made. Now let us speak of why this place, of all places, should have grown so great. There is something to be said for the hills and for the river and for the road. The 7 hills gave the early Romans high dry ground to live upon, defensible against their neighbors, healthy above the marshes, cooled by the breezes that the low valleys never felt. The Tiber gave them water and fish and a highway to the sea, which lay only a short distance downstream, and it gave them a barrier on one side against enemies. And the river crossing, the ford and later the bridge, gave them control of the great route along which men and goods moved up and down the western side of Italy. Whoever held that crossing held a key. The Romans held it. There was salt too, which mattered more in the ancient world than we might easily imagine. Near the mouth of the Tiber, where the river met the sea, lay flats where seawater could be dried to yield salt, that precious substance without which men could not preserve their food through the long months of winter. And an old road ran from those salt flats up along the river, inland to the peoples of the mountains who had no salt of their own and dearly wanted it. This road, the Salt Road, passed by the 7 hills, and the Romans, sitting astride it at the river crossing, controlled the trade in salt between the sea and the mountains. It was a humble sort of wealth, perhaps salt rather than gold, but it was steady and it was real, and it helped to make the early city prosperous, and it gave the Romans, from the very beginning, a place in the trade and traffic of their world. So the position was good, better than good, and the Romans made the most of it. But position alone does not explain everything, for many peoples held good ground and few of them built empires. There was something in the Romans themselves, in their character and their habits, that carried them so far. They were practical above all, people more interested in what worked than in what was beautiful or clever, builders and farmers and soldiers rather than poets and philosophers, at least in these early days. They were stubborn, slow to give up, willing to lose a battle and come back and lose another and come back again until at last they won. They valued duty and discipline and the keeping of one's word, the steady plain virtues of farmers and soldiers. And they had a gift, as we have said, for taking in others, for turning enemies into allies and allies into citizens, for growing not by crushing those they conquered, by binding them to Rome and making them in time Romans themselves. These were the seeds of greatness, planted in the small village on the hills, that would grow over the centuries into the largest empire the Western world had yet known. They were also from the beginning a people who absorbed others. Their legend itself tells us this. Romulus, the story goes, made his new city a refuge, welcoming the landless and the outcast and the wanderer, so that Rome filled quickly with men of every origin. And the Romans, throughout their whole long history, would keep this habit of taking in strangers and making them Romans, of extending their citizenship outward, of growing not only by conquest, but by inclusion. A small village on the Tiber would one day rule from the deserts of Africa to the cold rivers of the north, and part of the reason was this, that Rome was never closed. It was always, in its way, a city of the river crossing, a place where roads met and peoples mingled. But all of that lay far in the future, and even we are imagining. For now there is only the hill and the hut of the herdsman and the smoke rising into the gold of the western sky. There is the river below, moving slowly toward the sea, the same river that once carried 2 infants in a basket and set them down beneath a fig tree. There is the sound of sheep settling for the night on the slopes, and the call of a bird somewhere among the oaks, and the first faint stars appearing over the 7 hills. The shepherd children are asleep in their hut, the flocks are folded. The river murmurs on, patient and old, as it has murmured for 10,000 years and will murmur for 10,000 more. And on the Palatine, where the wolf once warmed 2 crying boys, the seeds of a city lie quietly in the dark, waiting for the centuries to come. You do not need to wait with them. You can let the river carry you now, the way it carried the basket, slow and gentle and sure. You can let the warmth of the hillside settle into you, and the soft dust of evening and the murmur of the water. There is nothing to do and nowhere to be, and no morning that will not come on its own. Rest now on the 7 hills beneath the first stars of Rome. Sleep well. Tonight let us travel together to the heart of an ancient city, to a wide paved hollow between green hills and the warm light of a late afternoon, where the business of a whole world was once carried out by men in white robes beneath the open sky. There is nothing here you need to attend to, no decision that cannot wait until you wake. You can let the words move over you like the murmur of a distant crowd, soft and far away, and let yourself drift slowly down towards sleep. This is the story of the Roman Republic and of the Forum where it lived. Picture, if you will, the city of Rome in the centuries when it was no longer a village and not yet an empire, when it had grown into a proud and busy town upon its 7 hills, and had done something that would echo through all of later history. It had sent away its kings. In the early days, as we have heard, Rome was ruled by kings. But the last of those kings, the Romans said, ruled badly and cruelly, and at last the people would bear it no longer. They drove him out. And then they made a decision that shaped the whole character of the city forever after. They swore that they would never again be ruled by a king. No single man would hold power over Rome. Instead, the people would govern themselves through chosen leaders who held their offices for only a short time and then laid them down again. They called this new way of doing things the res publica, the public thing, the affair of the people. From those 2 words comes our own word, republic. This was a remarkable idea, and the Romans were intensely proud of it. Power, they believed, should never rest too long in any one pair of hands. And so they built a government of careful balances, a machine of offices and councils designed to keep any single person from ever again becoming a king. Let us walk through how it worked, gently, the way you might walk through the Forum on a quiet evening. At the top stood 2 men called consuls, the chief magistrates of the Republic. There were always 2 of them, never one, and this was deliberate, for 2 men could check each other. They were elected and they held their office for a single year, and then they stepped down. The consul commanded the armies, presided over the great assemblies, and carried out the will of the state. But he knew all the while that his colleague sat beside him with equal power, and that in 12 months he would be a private citizen again. This was the Roman answer to the danger of kings: share the power and limit the time. Below the consuls were other officials, each with his own duty. There were men who managed the treasury and the grain supply, men who kept the rolls of citizens and watched over public morals, men who organized the festivals and the games. A Roman who wished to rise in public life climbed these offices one by one like the rungs of a ladder, each in its proper order and its proper year. The Romans called it the course of honors, and a man's whole life might be measured by how far up that ladder he climbed. And beneath and around all of this stood the Senate. The Senate was the great council of Rome, and it was the beating heart of the Republic. It was made up of several hundred men, the elders and former magistrates of the city, men who had served and governed and grown wise, or at least grown old in the service of the state. The Senate did not pass laws, strictly speaking, and it did not command armies directly, but its authority was enormous. It advised the magistrates. It guided foreign policy and managed the treasury and decided questions of war and peace. When the Senate spoke, with the weight of all its experience and all its dignity, the city listened. The Romans had a phrase for the combined authority of Senate and people, which they carved on their standards and their monuments: the Senate and the Roman people. Those 4 letters, SPQR, stood for the Republic itself, and Roman soldiers carried them to the ends of the earth. But the Senate was not the whole of Rome. The common people, the ordinary citizens, the farmers and craftsmen and shopkeepers had their own power too, and they had won it through long and patient struggle. In the early Republic, the great families, the patricians, held nearly all the offices and nearly all the privileges. The common people, the plebeians, chafed under this, and so, over many generations, they pressed for a greater share. They gained officials of their own, the tribunes, whose special duty was to protect the common people and who could veto, could simply forbid, actions of the magistrates that harmed the plebeians. They gained assemblies where the people voted on laws and elected their leaders. Slowly, decade by decade, Rome became a city where power was shared imperfectly and unequally, but really between the great and the small. There's a beauty in this slow climbing out of the common people toward a fairer share, and it is worth lingering over, for it tells us something gentle and hopeful about that hard old world. The plebeians did not, for the most part, win their rights by violence. They won them by a quieter and more patient means. When they felt themselves wronged, when the great families pressed too hard upon them, the common people of Rome had a remarkable weapon, and it was not the sword. It was simply to withdraw. They would gather up their families and their belongings and march out of the city altogether, out to a hill beyond the walls, and there they would sit, refusing to work, refusing to serve in the army, refusing to be a part of the city at all, until their grievances were heard. The Romans called this the secession of the plebs. And because a city cannot function without its working people, without its farmers and its craftsmen and its soldiers, the great families always, in the end, had to come out and bargain and to give a little more. Again and again, across the generations, the common people walked out, and again they came back having won a new right, a new protection, a new voice. It was a long, slow, peaceful revolution, carried out not with blood but with patience, and it shaped the Republic into something more balanced and more just than it had been. And so the Romans built, over centuries, a body of law written down at last so that it could not be twisted in secret by the powerful, and set up in a forum for all to see. The earliest of these laws were carved upon tablets and displayed in public, so that every citizen, great or small, could know what the law was and claim its protection. This was a precious thing, the idea that the law should be known and written, and the same for everyone, standing above any single man, even the highest. The Romans did not always live up to it, but they held it as an ideal, and from their long labor over law grew a tradition of jurisprudence so deep and so careful that it became the foundation of the legal systems of much of the world, studied and built upon for 2,000 years after the Republic itself had passed away. This long, patient working out of who should hold power and how much and for how long is one of the things that makes the Roman Republic so endlessly studied. The Romans were not perfect. Their republic was no democracy as we would understand it. Wealth counted heavily, and the votes of the rich weighed more than the votes of the poor, and slavery underlay the whole of their society. But they had built something genuinely new, a state where the rule of one man was forbidden, where offices were temporary, where law stood above any individual, and where the people in their assemblies held a real and lasting voice. For nearly 500 years this republic governed Rome, and under it Rome grew from one city among many into the master of the whole Mediterranean world. Now let us go down into the place where all of this happened. Let us go down into the Forum. The Roman Forum lay in the valley between the Palatine Hill and the Capitolium, in that low hollow that had once been a marsh, drained long ago by the early kings. It was a long, open, paved space, surrounded by temples and public buildings, and it was the center of everything. If the Republic had a heart, this was it. Here the assemblies met. Here the courts sat in judgment. Here the great men of Rome made their speeches, and the crowds gathered to listen. Here merchants traded and friends met, and gossip flew from mouth to mouth. To be in the Forum was to be at the very center of the Roman world. Let us picture it on an ordinary day, in the warm light of the afternoon. The Forum is full of people. Men in togas, the heavy white woolen robe that marked a Roman citizen, move in twos and threes across the paving stones, deep in conversation. The toga is not an easy garment to wear. It must be draped just so, and a man wearing it carries himself with a certain dignity, one arm wrapped, his step unhurried. Among them move countless others, slaves carrying messages and baskets, country people in from the farms gawking at the temples, sellers calling out their wares, children darting between the columns. Around the open space rise the great buildings of the state. There is the Senate House, a tall plain hall of brick and stone, where the senators gather on their benches to debate. There are the temples, their fronts crowded with columns, their steps worn smooth by generations of feet, the homes of the gods who watched over Rome. There is the temple of the goddess Vesta, round rather than rectangular, where a sacred flame was kept burning day and night by priestesses, for the Romans believed that as long as that fire burned, the city would endure. There are the speakers' platforms, raised stone stages from which the orators address the crowds, decorated with the bronze prows of captured enemy ships. And everywhere there is sound, the murmur of hundreds of voices, the cry of a vendor, the bark of a dog, the clear carrying voice of an orator on the platform gesturing to the crowd below, his words rising and falling in the practiced rhythms of Roman speech. For the Romans loved the spoken word above almost anything. A man who could stand before the people and move them with his voice, who could argue a case in the courts or sway a vote in the assembly, held a kind of power that no office could give. The greatest of the Roman orators were famous throughout the city, their speeches remembered and repeated, their phrases passed from mouth to mouth. Let us follow one such moment. An orator climbs the platform. The crowd gathers below, falling slowly quiet. He begins to speak, perhaps on a matter of war or a proposed law or the conduct of some magistrate. His voice is calm at first, reasonable, drawing the crowd in. Then it rises, swelling with feeling, his arms sweeping out over the listeners. He builds his argument stone by stone, the way the Romans built everything, and the crowd sways with him, murmuring, nodding, calling out. This was the life of the Republic in its truest form. Free men, gathered in the open, persuaded by words rather than commanded by force. Around the edges of the forum lay the business of daily life. There were shops and stalls, money changers at their tables, lawyers waiting to be hired, scribes ready to write a letter for a fee. There were the basilicas, great covered halls where people could shelter from the sun or the rain, and where courts held their sessions, the judges hearing cases, the advocates arguing, the witnesses called. Justice in Rome was a public matter, conducted in the open, watched by the crowd. Let us pause a while among the stones of the Forum and consider how this place had grown, layer upon layer, across the long centuries, for it was not built all at once but gathered slowly, like a coral reef, each generation adding its own temples and halls and monuments to those of the generations before. The oldest buildings stood among the newest. A temple raised by the early Republic might stand beside a hall built 300 years later, and between them a monument to some victory won in a war that even the old men could barely remember. The Forum was a kind of stone memory of the whole Roman past, and a Roman walking through it walked among the deeds of his ancestors, surrounded on every side by reminders of who his people had been and what they had done. Here was the spot where a famous hero had made his stand. There was the column raised to honor a great victory at sea, decorated with the bronze rams of the captured ships. Yonder stood the ancient wellhead, and the sacred fig tree, and the black stone that marked, men said, a holy and mysterious place from the very earliest days of the city. To walk in the Forum was to walk through time itself, among the accumulated honors and memories of 700 years. And there were the monuments to the great processions of triumph, for when a Roman general won a great victory, the highest honor the Republic could give him was a triumph, a magnificent parade through the city, along the sacred way that ran through the heart of the Forum. Let us imagine such a day, for it was among the grandest sights of the ancient world. The victorious general, his face painted red in the old fashion, dressed in robes of purple and gold, rode through the city in a chariot drawn by white horses, and before him marched his soldiers and the captives he had taken, and wagons heaped with the plunder and the treasure of the conquered lands. Trumpets sounded, and the people lined the streets and cheered, and the whole city gave itself over to celebration. Yet even in that moment of supreme glory, the Romans, who feared above all the swelling of any one man's pride, set a slave behind the general in his chariot, to hold the golden crown above his head and to whisper to him, again and again, amid all the cheering, a reminder that he was only a man and would die like other men. Such was the wisdom of the Republic, that even at the height of triumph it would not let a man forget that he was mortal, and not a god, and not a king. And running through it all was the rhythm of the Roman calendar, the festivals and the holy days, the sacrifices and the processions. The Romans were a deeply religious people, and their religion was woven into the work of the state. No assembly met, no war was begun, no important act was undertaken, without first consulting the will of the gods, reading the signs in the flight of birds or the entrails of sacrificed animals. The priests of Rome were not a class apart, but were drawn from the same great families who held the offices of state. To govern Rome and to serve its gods were, in the Roman mind, almost the same thing. Let us walk for a while among the ordinary business of the Forum, away from the great speeches and the solemn councils, down among the stalls and the shops and the everyday traffic of the place, for the Forum was not only a stage for history, but a marketplace and a meeting ground, the living center of an ordinary city. In the morning, the Forum filled early. Country people came in from the farms with their produce, and merchants opened their stalls, and the money changers set out their tables and their scales, for Rome was a city of trade, and the Forum was where much of it was done. There were sellers of bread and oil and wine, of cloth and pottery and trinkets, calling their wares to the passing crowd. There were the booths of the bankers, where a man might deposit his money or borrow it or send it safely to a distant city by letter. There were barbers cutting hair in the open air, and that was where men gathered to hear the news and trade their gossip, for the barber's stool was the newspaper of the ancient world, the place where every rumor of the city passed from ear to ear. And there were the schools held in the open colonnades or in rented rooms along the edges of the Forum, where the children of Rome learned their letters and their numbers, reciting in sing-song voices, sometimes feeling the sting of the schoolmaster's cane, just as children have always done. There were the offices of the lawyers and the notaries, where contracts were drawn and wills were witnessed and disputes were settled. There were the temples, busy all day with worshippers bringing their offerings, and the priests carrying out the endless small rituals that bound the city to its gods. And over it all hung the great clamor of a city's daily life, the cries and the bargaining and the laughter and the argument, the tramp of feet on the worn stones, the rumble of cartwheels, the barking of dogs and the calling of vendors, rising up into the warm air between the temples and the halls. This was the Forum too, not only the grand stage of senators and orators, but the busy beating heart of an ordinary human city, full of the same small businesses and pleasures and troubles that fill any city in any age. There is something deeply comforting in that thought, that beneath all the grand history, the wars and the laws and the great men, Rome was at bottom a place where people simply lived, bought their bread, cut their hair, taught their children, gossiped with their neighbors, said their prayers, and went home at the end of the day. The Forum saw all of it, the high and the low, the eternal and the everyday, gathered together in one wide paved hollow between the hills for hundreds upon hundreds of years. Now let us step back and consider what it meant to live under the Republic as a citizen of Rome in those long centuries. It meant that you belonged to something larger than yourself, something old and dignified and proud. It meant that you had a voice, however small, in the assemblies, a vote to cast, a tribune to protect you. It meant that no man, however great, could lawfully set himself above the law and rule you as a master. The Romans of the Republic held this freedom dear, and they told stories to their children of the heroes of old who had defended it. The man who gave up supreme power and went back to his farm when the danger was past, the consul who put the good of the state above his own family, the citizens who chose death rather than submission to a king. These were the values the Republic taught: duty, restraint, service, and above all the conviction that the state belonged to the people and not to any one man. In time, as we shall hear in the chapters to come, the Republic would falter and fall. The very men whose words filled the Forum would turn at last to swords, and ambitious generals would gather power that no single man was ever meant to hold, and the old balance would break. But that is a later story. Tonight we stay in the Forum at its height, in the warm light of the afternoon, among the togas and the temples and the rising voices of free men. Let the murmur of the crowd grow soft and far away now. Let the orator's voice fade into the gentle hum of evening. The light is turning golden across the paving stones, and the long shadows of the columns are stretching out across the Forum, and the people are beginning, one by one, to drift toward home. The sacred flame burns steadily in the Temple of Vesta, watching over the sleeping city. The Senate House stands quiet. The platforms are empty now, and the great open space is settling into the stillness of evening. There is nothing left to decide today. The speeches are finished, the votes are cast, the business of the Republic is done. You can let it all go, the way the Forum lets go of its crowds at the end of the day, slowly and easily into the soft dark. Rest now in the heart of Rome, beneath the watching stars. Sleep well. Tonight, let us travel together into the life of a single man, one of the most famous men who ever lived, whose name has come down through 20 centuries and become almost a word for power itself. We will move slowly through his story, the way one walks through an old gallery, pausing before each scene in no hurry at all. There is nothing here you need to remember, no thread you must hold. You can let the words drift over you and let yourself sink gently and willingly towards sleep. This is the story of Gaius Julius Caesar. Picture, if you will, the city of Rome in the last century before the Common Era, when the Republic we spoke of was old and great and beginning, very slowly, to come apart. Rome by now ruled an enormous sweep of lands around the Mediterranean Sea. Its armies had conquered Greece and Spain and the coasts of Africa and the rich kingdoms of the East. Wealth poured into the city, and with the wealth came ambition, and with the ambition came trouble. The old balance of the Republic, where no man rose too high, was straining. Great generals returned from their wars with armies loyal to themselves rather than to the state, and the men of Rome eyed one another with suspicion, each wondering who might reach too far. Into this restless, dangerous, glittering Rome, Caesar was born into one of the old patrician families, a family proud of its ancient name but no longer rich or powerful as it once had been. He claimed descent, as the great families did, from the heroes and even the gods of legend, tracing his bloodline back to the goddess of love herself. But noble blood alone did not make a man great in Rome. He had to earn his place, and Caesar set out to earn it with an energy and a daring that astonished even his own ambitious age. Let us follow him, then, through the great chapters of his life. As a young man, Caesar was known for his charm, his quick mind, and his enormous appetite for life. He was tall and pale and carried himself with elegance, careful of his appearance, generous with his money even when he had little of it, and gifted with a tongue that could win over a crowd or a courtroom. He borrowed vast sums to fund the public games and feasts that won the affection of the people, gambling that the favor of the crowd would carry him upward. It was a dangerous game, for his debts grew enormous, but Caesar had a gambler's nerve, and he played for the highest stakes there were. There's a story from his youth that the Romans loved to tell, for it showed his character in a single bright flash. Sailing across the sea as a young man, he was captured by pirates who held him for ransom. When they named the price of his freedom, Caesar laughed and told them the sum was far too low for a man of his importance, and insisted they demand more. While he waited for the ransom to be gathered, he lived among the pirates as though he were their leader rather than their prisoner, joining their games, reciting them his speeches and poems, and telling them cheerfully that once he was free he would return and have them all crucified. They laughed at this, thinking it the boast of a charming young captive. But when at last the ransom came and he was set free, Caesar did exactly as he had promised. He raised a fleet, hunted the pirates down, and saw them put to death. The Romans told this tale because it held, in miniature, everything Caesar would become: the audacity, the pride, the perfect confidence, and the iron will beneath the easy charm. Let us linger a moment on the world in which this young man rose, for it helps us to understand him. Rome in those years was a city of glaring contrasts, of dazzling wealth and bitter poverty crowded together within the same walls. The great families had grown enormously rich on the plunder of conquered provinces, building marble villas and filling them with the treasures of the East, dining off gold and silver, attended by armies of slaves. And in the same city, in the same streets, the common people lived crowded into tall and flimsy tenements, often hungry, often out of work, their old farms swallowed up by the great estates of the wealthy. This gulf between the few who had everything and the many who had little was the great wound of the late Republic, and it made the city restless and dangerous, a place where an ambitious man, by championing the cause of the common people, might rise to enormous power, and where the streets themselves could become a battleground. Caesar understood this from the beginning. He saw that the favor of the crowd was a kind of power that the proud old senators in their disdain overlooked, and he set himself all his life to win it. He took the side of the common people in their struggles. He spent his fortune, and fortunes he borrowed, on games and feasts and grand public works for their benefit, and the people loved him for it, with a love that would one day prove stronger than the daggers of his enemies. Caesar climbed the ladder of Roman offices as ambitious men did, winning election after election, spending wildly, building his name. He allied himself with the most powerful men of his day, forming a private partnership with two of them, one the richest man in Rome, the other its greatest soldier. Together these three dominated the politics of the city, dividing its honors and its provinces among themselves. For Caesar's share, he secured for himself the command of the lands to the north, the vast and little-known country the Romans called Gaul, which lay across the mountains where modern France and Belgium stretch today. And it was in Gaul that Caesar became Caesar. For most of a decade he campaigned in those northern lands, leading his legions through forests and across rivers, fighting tribe after tribe of fierce and warlike peoples. He was a soldier of extraordinary gifts, swift, decisive, willing to dare what others thought impossible, and beloved by his men who would follow him anywhere. He shared their hardships, learned their names, rewarded their courage, and asked of them feats that no other general would have dared to ask, and they gave him what he asked because they trusted him completely. He marched faster than his enemies believed possible, appearing where he was not expected, striking before they were ready. He even crossed the narrow sea to the misty island of Britain, a place that to the Romans lay at the very edge of the world, so that his name should be linked forever with the conquest of lands no Roman general had reached before. Caesar wrote of these campaigns himself, in plain and elegant Latin, in books that schoolchildren would read for 2,000 years afterward. He told the story of his wars in the third person calmly, as though describing the deeds of another man, and through that calm, clear prose his fame spread throughout Rome. By the time his years in Gaul were done, he was the most famous and the most dangerous man in the Roman world. He had a veteran army that worshipped him, a treasury full of the plunder of his conquests, and a name that rang in every ear. And this made the men who had once been his allies afraid. His partnership with the other great men of Rome had frayed. One of them had died in a distant war. The other, the great soldier, had drifted to the side of Caesar's enemies in the Senate, the men who feared what Caesar had become and wished to bring him down before he grew greater still. They ordered him to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen, knowing that without his legions he would be at their mercy. Caesar knew it too. To obey was to be destroyed. To refuse was to make war upon his own country. He came at last to a small river in the north of Italy called the Rubicon, which marked the boundary of his province. To cross it with his army was forbidden by law, an act of war against the Republic itself. Caesar stood on its bank, the Romans said, and weighed everything in the balance, his life, his honor, the peace of his country, the whole future of the world, and then he crossed. As he led his soldiers over the little stream, he is said to have spoken words that have echoed ever since. The die is cast, there was no going back now. The throw was made, the gamble taken, and whatever came of it would come. It is worth pausing on that small river, the Rubicon, for it has become one of the great images of all history, a phrase we still use when we mean a point of no return, a choice that cannot be unmade. It was in itself a modest stream, easily crossed, of no importance at all save for the line it marked, and yet to step across it with an army was to change the world. Caesar, the histories tell us, hesitated on its bank. For all his daring, for all his gambler's nerve, he understood the gravity of what he was about to do. To cross was to plunge his country into civil war, to set Roman against Roman, to risk everything he had built and everything he was. He could still turn back. He could still lay down his command and trust to the mercy of his enemies, and perhaps save his country a great deal of blood at the cost of his own destruction. For a long moment he stood weighing it, and then he made the choice that was, perhaps, the only one a man of his nature could make. He chose to go forward, and in that choice we see the whole tragedy of the late Republic in miniature. A great man with a great army loyal to himself alone, faced with the choice between his own ruin and the ruin of the state, choosing himself. It was the choice that the whole rotten structure of the time pushed men toward, and Caesar was not the first to make it, nor the last. But his crossing of that little river became the symbol of them all. What came of it was civil war, Roman against Roman, the legions of Caesar against the armies of his enemies, fought across the whole breadth of the Roman world, from Italy to Greece to Egypt to the deserts of Africa and the plains of Spain. It was a terrible thing, this war among brothers, and the Romans never quite recovered from it, but Caesar's genius and his fortune carried him through. He defeated his great rival, the famous soldier, in a single decisive battle in Greece, and pursued the war to its end in every corner of the Mediterranean until no enemy army stood against him. It was during these wars that Caesar came to Egypt, to the ancient and glittering city of Alexandria, and there became entangled with its young queen, Cleopatra, the last great ruler of the line of the pharaohs. Their meeting and their alliance became one of the most famous stories of the ancient world, a tale of two of the most remarkable people of their age, drawn together by politics and by something more. But that is a story that belongs as much to Egypt as to Rome, and tonight we follow Caesar home. For he did come home at last victorious, the master of the Roman world. No man had ever held such power in the Republic. The Senate heaped honors upon him. He was made dictator, an old Roman office meant to be held only briefly in times of crisis, but for him it was extended again and again and finally made to last for life. His image appeared on the coins of Rome, a thing never before done for a living man. He sat in a gilded chair. The statues stood among those of the gods. He reformed the calendar, fixing the year and the months in a form so good that we still use a version of it today, and he gave his own name to one of the months, the month we still call July. Let us dwell for a moment on the strangeness of what Caesar had become, for it sat at the very heart of the trouble that would destroy him. For 500 years, as we have heard, Rome had governed itself without a master, sharing power among many hands, limiting every office to a single year, forbidding above all the rule of one man. The whole pride and identity of the Roman people was bound up in that freedom. And now here was Caesar, holding power without limit and without end, his image on the coins, his statues among the gods, his chair of gold, his name upon the calendar. He had not seized a crown, exactly. He had not declared himself a king. But he had gathered into his single person nearly all the power of the state, and the old forms of the Republic, the elections and the assemblies and the rotating offices, went on around him now like the motions of a body whose soul had departed, mere shadows of the thing they once had been. Some Romans welcomed this. They were weary of the endless strife and bloodshed, and they were glad to have a strong and capable hand at the helm. bringing order out of chaos. But others, the proud heirs of the old families, could not bear it. To them, the freedom of the Republic was the most precious thing in the world, worth more than peace, worth more than order, worth more than their own lives, and the sight of one man holding all that power was a thing not to be endured. Caesar used his power, by most accounts, with wisdom and even mercy. He pardoned many of his old enemies rather than destroying them. He passed laws to relieve debt and settle his veterans on the land, to found new colonies and bring order to the unruly city. He planned great works, the draining of marshes, the building of harbors and libraries. He was, in many ways, a ruler of vision and generosity. But he had become, in all but name, a king. And Rome, as we have heard, had sworn 500 years before that it would never again be ruled by a king. This was the heart of the matter, and it could not be resolved. Many of the proud old senators, men who loved the Republic and the freedom it stood for, looked upon Caesar's gathered power with horror. To them, he was the destroyer of everything Rome held sacred, a tyrant in the making, and they resolved that he must die so that the Republic might live. It is worth pausing here to consider the men who plotted against him, for they were not villains in their own eyes, but as they saw it, patriots and liberators. They were senators of the old families, heirs to that long tradition of Roman freedom we have spoken of, men raised from childhood on the stories of the heroes who had cast out the kings and defended the Republic against any who would master it. To them, Caesar's gathered power was not a blessing but a mortal threat, the death of everything they held sacred. They had seen the Republic, which had endured for 500 years, reduced to a hollow shell about a single man, and they could not bear it. Some among them had been Caesar's enemies in the war and had been pardoned by him, and now turned that very mercy against him. For a free man, they felt, could not live as the pensioner of a master, owing his life to another's grace. Others had been his friends, even his favorites, men he had raised and honored and trusted. The leaders of the plot were among the most respected men in Rome, drawn to the deed not by hatred, but by a terrible and mistaken devotion to the old ideal of liberty. They told themselves that by killing one man they could bring back the Republic of their ancestors, that the old freedom would spring up again once the tyrant was gone. They were wrong, tragically and completely wrong, but they did not know it, and they went to their dreadful work believing themselves the saviors of Rome. And so we come to the most famous day in Roman history, a day in the middle of the month of March in the great hall where the Senate was meeting. Warnings had reached Caesar, omens and whispers that he should beware this day, but he was a man who did not bend to fear, and he went to the Senate as he had planned. There, as he took his seat, the conspirators gathered around him on the pretext of a petition, and then drew their hidden daggers and struck. More than 20 of them, men of the oldest families of Rome, fell upon him together, and Caesar, surrounded, wrapped his robe about his face and fell. Among the men striking at him, the Romans said, was one he had pardoned and loved as a son, and at the sight of him Caesar gave up the struggle. He died at the foot of a statue of his old rival, the great soldier he had defeated in the war. The men who killed him believed they had saved the Republic. They had not, they had ended it, for Caesar's death did not restore the old freedom. It only plunged Rome back into civil war, fiercer than before, and out of that war would rise not a republic but an empire, ruled at last, openly and without apology, by a single man. The thing the conspirators had feared most was the very thing their daggers brought about. But that again is a story for the chapter to come. Tonight we let the great man rest. We let the noise of the forum fade, and the cries of the city, and the clash of all those armies on all those distant fields. We let Caesar lie in the long quiet that comes to all men at the last, the conqueror and the conquered alike, the kings and the herdsmen, all of them gathered in at the end into the same deep silence. It is evening now over Rome. The temples stand dark against the fading sky, and the lamps are being lit in the houses on the hills, and the river moves on as it always has, slow and patient and untroubled by the deeds of men. The ambitions and the daggers and the crowns all settle in time into stillness, and you who carry none of them can settle too, gently, into the soft dark of sleep. Rest now, the story is told, and the day is done. Sleep well. Tonight let us travel together into a long season of peace, into the reign of the man who took a city torn by war and gave it, at last, a measure of calm that lasted for generations. His was a quiet kind of greatness, patient and careful, and his story is best told slowly, in a low voice, as the lamps burn down. There is nothing here you need to carry. You can let the words gather softly around you, like the warm dusk settling over the rooftops of an old city, and let yourself drift gently down towards sleep. This is the story of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Picture, if you will, the Roman world in the years just after the death of the great Caesar. Rome was in turmoil. The daggers that had struck down the dictator had not brought back the old republic. They had only opened a new and bloodier round of civil war. The men who would inherit Caesar's power were circling one another, each gathering armies, each reaching for the prize. And among them, no one expected the young man who would win it all. His name at first was Octavian. He was Caesar's great-nephew, a slight, often sickly young man of no great reputation who happened to be named in Caesar's will as his adopted son and chief heir. When the news of the murder reached him, he was scarcely 18 years old, a youth studying far from Rome. The hardened generals and politicians of the day regarded him as a boy, a name without an army, easily used and easily discarded. It could not have been more wrong. For beneath his quiet manner and his frail health, this young man possessed one of the most formidable minds of the ancient world. He was patient where others were rash, cautious where others were bold, and willing to wait years for what others grasped at in a moment. He understood people and he understood power, and above all he understood the deep weariness of the Roman world, its longing after so many years of bloodshed for nothing so much as peace and order. And he made himself, in the end, the man who could give it. Let us follow him through the long climb. The young heir gathered the loyalty of Caesar's old soldiers, who flocked to the name they had loved. He maneuvered through the deadly politics of the dying republic with a coldness and a skill far beyond his years, making alliances and breaking them as the moment required, joining with Caesar's chief lieutenant to hunt down and destroy the men who had killed his adoptive father. For a time he shared power with that lieutenant and one other, the three of them dividing the Roman world among them as Caesar and his partners had done a generation before. But such partnerships never lasted, and this one too came apart. At the last it came down to two men, Octavian in the west, ruling Italy and the lands of Europe, and his former ally in the east, the famous general Mark Antony, who had joined himself to Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. The rivalry between these two grew until it could end only in war, and the war ended in a single great sea battle off the coast of Greece, where Octavian's fleet shattered the forces of Antony and the Queen. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, and there, with their cause lost, took their own lives. And Octavian, still only in his early 30s, stood alone, the undisputed master of the entire Roman world, from Spain to Syria, from the cold rivers of the north to the sands of Africa. Let us pause and consider the long road of blood by which he had come to this height, for it was a darker journey than the calm of his later years might suggest. The young heir had not won his place by gentleness. In the desperate years after Caesar's death, when he joined with the other two great men to crush the murderers of his adoptive father, they had carried out a terrible purge of their enemies, proscription, the Romans called it, in which the names of the condemned were posted publicly and a price set upon every head, so that any man might be slain for a reward, his property seized, his family ruined. Many of the noblest men of Rome perished in those days, hunted down and killed, betrayed sometimes by their own servants or even their own kin for the bounty. It was a savage business, and the young Octavian had a full share in it. The man who would later be remembered as the bringer of peace had waded through a great deal of blood to reach his throne, and the Romans did not forget it, though in the long calm of his later reign the memory faded, as such memories do, beneath the gratitude of a world grown weary of war and glad of rest. This is one of the harder truths of his story, and it is worth holding gently alongside the rest, that the great peace of Augustus was founded upon a great violence, that the order he gave the world was bought with years of slaughter, and that the calm of his maturity grew out of the ruthlessness of his youth. Such is the way of much that is built in this world, that its quiet fruit grows from hard and bitter roots, but the fruit, in the end, was real. Whatever the cost of reaching it, the peace that Augustus made was a true peace, and millions of ordinary people, for generations after, lived out their lives in a safety and a calm that their grandparents, in the age of civil wars, could only have dreamed of. Now came the hardest part, and the part that revealed his true genius. For Caesar had one such mastery too, and Caesar had been murdered for it. The Romans, as we have heard, hated kings, and they had killed the man they thought wished to become one. Octavian had seen this with his own eyes. He knew that to rule openly as a king, to wear a crown and sit a throne, was to invite the dagger. And so he did something subtler and far cleverer. He took absolute power and he hid it. He gave back to the Senate and the people with great ceremony the powers he had gathered during the wars. He declared the Republic restored. He took no crown and no kingly title. He called himself merely the first citizen, the leading man among equals, the servant of the state. The old forms of the Republic went on as before. The Senate met, the consuls were elected, the assemblies gathered, the magistrates held their offices. To a casual eye, Rome was still a republic, and Octavian was simply its most respected citizen, freely honored for his services. But beneath this careful surface, the reality was that he held in his own hands all the threads of real power. He commanded the armies, he governed the most important provinces, he controlled the treasury and the grain that fed the city. His word, gently offered as advice, was in truth command. The Senate, grateful and weary and afraid, granted him honor after honor, and at last gave him a new name, a name that meant the revered one, the one touched by the favor of the gods. They called him Augustus. And by that name he is known to history. This was his masterpiece, to hold the substance of a king's power while wearing the mask of a republican citizen, so that the Romans could keep their pride in their old forms while accepting, in fact, the rule of one man. It was a kind of grand and gentle fiction, and both sides agreed to believe it, because both sides were exhausted by war and longed for peace. And peace, at last, is what Augustus gave them. Let us speak now of that peace, for it was the great gift of his reign, and the thing for which the world remembered him. The Romans called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and it would last, with only brief interruptions, for some 200 years. After a century of civil wars, of armies marching against armies and citizens slaying citizens, the violence at last subsided. The gates of the temple of the god of war in Rome, which by ancient custom stood open in time of war and were closed only in time of peace, were shut by Augustus, an event so rare that it had happened only a handful of times in all of Roman history. Across the vast sweep of the empire from the Atlantic to the deserts of the east, men could travel and trade in safety, the roads open, the seas cleared of pirates, the frontiers held by the legions. A merchant could journey from Britain to Egypt under a single law and a single peace. The world, or so much of it as Rome ruled, breathed out and grew quiet. And Augustus set himself to the long, patient work of building a state that could endure. He reorganized the army, settling its veterans on the land and fixing its loyalty to himself and to the office he held. He reformed the governing of the provinces, replacing the greedy plunder of the old days with a more orderly and honest administration. He built and rebuilt the city of Rome itself, until he could boast, near the end of his life, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. New temples rose, and theaters and public squares, and great works of water and stone. He patronized the poets and the artists, and under his peace there flowered one of the greatest ages of Roman literature, poets whose verses would be read for 2,000 years, singing of Rome and its gods and its long destiny. He tried, too, to restore what he saw as the old virtues of Rome, the simple, sturdy values of duty and family and piety that he believed had made the city great before wealth and ambition corrupted it. He passed laws to encourage marriage and children, to discourage extravagance, to revive the worship of the old gods. He himself lived, or made a great show of living, with a studied simplicity in a modest house, wearing plain clothes woven, it was said, by the women of his own household. Whether the Romans truly became more virtuous under his urging may be doubted, but the image he projected of a humble servant of the state restoring the ancient ways was a powerful one, and it helped to bind the new order to the old memories. Let us walk for a while through the Rome that Augustus built, for the transformation of the city was one of the proudest achievements of his long reign, and it is a pleasant thing to picture. When he came to power, Rome was, for all its greatness, a crowded and somewhat shabby city, a warren of narrow streets and old brick buildings, grand in its public spaces but cramped and disorderly in much of its sprawl. Augustus set himself to make it worthy of its place as the capital of the world. He built new temples gleaming with marble, their columns rising white against the sky. He raised great public squares, wide and ordered and adorned with statues, where the people could gather and the business of the city could be done in dignity. He built a vast new forum of his own, and a great altar dedicated to the peace he had brought, carved with processions of figures so lifelike that they seem almost to breathe even today. He restored the ancient temples that had fallen into disrepair, dozens of them, mending the broken houses of the gods. He saw to the water supply and the roads and the protection of the city against fire and flood. and he organized the sprawling city into districts, each with its own local officials and its own small shrines, bringing order to the chaos of the streets. It was of this great work that he made his famous boast near the end of his life, that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. And it was true. The Rome that he handed on to the ages, the Rome of gleaming temples and broad squares and noble monuments, the Rome that would be the model of imperial grandeur for all the centuries to come, was in large part his creation. He had taken a city and made it a wonder, and in doing so he had given the Roman people a visible symbol of the new age, a capital as grand and as ordered and as peaceful as the empire he had built around it. And under that peace, in those quiet and prosperous years, there flowered an age of art and letters such as Rome had never known. The poets of the time of Augustus sang of Rome and its gods and its long and glorious destiny, and their verses were so fine that they were read and loved and learned by heart for 2,000 years afterward, in lands the poets themselves had never heard of. One sang the great epic of Rome's legendary founding, tracing the city's origins back to a wandering hero who had escaped a burning city in the east and come, after long wanderings, to the shores of Italy, there to father the line that would one day build Rome. Another sang of the farms and the seasons and the quiet pleasures of country life, in verses of such sweetness that they have never been surpassed. It was a golden age of the Roman mind, and it was made possible by the peace and the patronage of Augustus, who understood that a great empire needed not only roads and legions, but also beauty and song, and a story of itself worthy of its greatness. For all his power, Augustus was a careful and a patient man, and he ruled for a very long time, more than 40 years, longer than almost any Roman ruler before or after. He was not without sorrows. His attempts to settle the succession, to find an heir who might carry on his work, were dogged by death and disappointment, as one after another of the young men he favored died before him. The great expansion of the empire suffered its worst blow in his reign, when 3 whole legions were ambushed and destroyed in the dark forests of Germany, a loss so terrible that the old emperor, the histories say, would wander his palace at night crying out for his lost soldiers. After that, he fixed the frontiers and counseled his successors to expand the empire no further, to hold what Rome had rather than reach for more. But these were shadows on a long and largely peaceful reign. When at last Augustus died, an old man in his 70s, after more than 4 decades of rule, he left behind something that had never existed before, a stable empire at peace within itself, governed by one man but clothed in the dignity of the old republic, and ready to be handed on to a successor. The republic was gone, though few would say so aloud. What had taken its place was the thing we call the Roman Empire, and Augustus was its founder and its first emperor, the model that every emperor after him would imitate. For centuries to come, the rulers of Rome would take his name as a title. To be emperor was to be an Augustus. Let us think for a moment, before we leave him, of the strange and lonely thing it was to be the first of the emperors, to hold a power that no Roman had held before, and to have no example to follow in the holding of it. Everything Augustus did, he did for the first time. There had been kings before, and conquerors and dictators, but there had never been quite this. A man who ruled the whole Roman world absolutely while pretending not to rule it at all, who had to invent, as he went, the very art of being an emperor, with no one to teach him, and no one he could fully trust. He had no model for how a successor should be chosen, and so he tried one arrangement after another, marrying his daughter to the men he favored, adopting heirs, drawing up plans, only to watch death undo them one by one. He had no model for how the provinces should be governed under the new order, or how the army should be paid in pensioni, or how the delicate fiction of the restored republic should be maintained year after year. And all of these things he had to work out himself, patiently, by trial and by care, across the long decades of his reign. It was a lonely labor and a vast one, and he bore it almost to the end with the same quiet, unhurried steadiness that had carried him up from a sickly boy to the master of the world. And the thing he built endured. That is the measure of his genius, not merely that he gained power, for many men have gained power and lost it again within their lifetimes, but that he built something that lasted, an order so well made that it carried on for centuries after him, through good emperors and bad, through the wise and the mad and the cruel, holding together by the sheer strength of the foundations he had laid. The Roman peace that began with him would shelter the Western world for generations, and the office he created would outlast him by 500 years in the West and far longer in the East. Few men in all of history have shaped the world so deeply and so durably, and fewer still have done it so quietly, with so little show, behind so modest a mask. There's a story that on his deathbed, Augustus asked his friends whether he had played his part well in the comedy of life, and bid them, if so, to send him off with their applause. It was a fitting end for a man who had ruled so much by performance, by the careful playing of a role, the mask of the modest citizen worn over the face of the master of the world. He had played the part for more than 40 years, and he had played it well enough to give the Roman world the longest peace it had ever known. And so we leave him in the quiet of his passing, an old man at the end of a long day's work. The lamps are burning low in the marble city he built. The roads run out to the far frontiers, silent in the night, held safe by the watchful legions. The seas are calm and the gates of the temple of war are closed, and across an empire of many peoples and many tongues, men and women sleep beneath a single peace. You can rest within that peace too now. There is no war tonight, no struggle, nothing to guard against. The watch is kept by others, far away on the dark frontiers, and you are safe in the warm heart of the sleeping world. Let the marble city grow dim around you, and the lamps go out one by one, and the long Roman peace settle over you like a soft and heavy blanket. Rest now in the quiet that Augustus made. Sleep well. Tonight let us travel together to the center of the greatest city of the ancient world, to stand before a vast ring of stone that has watched over Rome for nearly 2,000 years. We will walk through it slowly in the soft light of memory, in no hurry to reach anything. There is nothing here you must do, no crowd you must join. You can let the words wash over you like the murmur of a great gathering heard from far away, and let yourself sink gently and easily towards sleep. This is the story of the Colosseum. Picture, if you will, the city of Rome at the height of its power, perhaps a century after the time of Augustus, when the empire stretched across the whole of the known world, and the city at its heart had swelled to nearly 1 million people, the largest city humanity had yet built. In the middle of this immense and crowded place, where once there had been a tyrant emperor's private lake, the rulers of Rome raised a building of such size and grandeur that it would outlast the empire itself, and stand, broken but unbowed, into our own day. The Romans called it the Flavian Amphitheater, after the family of emperors who built it. We know it by another name, given long after, the Colosseum. Let us first simply stand before it, and let its size settle into us. It is enormous, a great oval ring of pale stone and brick, rising in tier upon tier of arches, so tall that to look up at it is to bend your neck back. It stands as high as a building of a dozen or more modern stories, and it stretches around in a vast ellipse longer than 180 meters on its greater axis. Around its outside run row upon row of arched openings, 80 arches to each level, framed by columns, the whole great curving wall climbing in ordered tiers toward the sky. In its day, the upper edge was hung with a forest of wooden masts, and from these masts a great awning could be drawn across, an enormous cloth canopy unfurled by sailors of the Roman fleet to shade the crowds from the sun. Imagine that, a roof of sailcloth drawn across the open sky above 50,000 people. For that is how many it could hold, 50,000 spectators, perhaps more, gathered within its curving tiers. To grasp what the Colosseum was, you must first imagine that crowd, for the building was made for them, shaped around them, designed with a genius that we still admire, to bring them in and seat them, and send them home again with an ease that few buildings even today can match. Let us speak of how it worked, for the cleverness of it is part of its wonder, and it is a soothing thing to consider, the patient ingenuity of the people who built it. The Colosseum was, in a sense, a great machine for managing a crowd. Around its base ran those 80 arched entrances, and each was numbered, and each ticket holder knew, from marks upon his token, which gate to enter, which stairway to climb, which tier and which section and which seat were his. Through these many doors, the vast crowd could pour in and find their places quickly, and at the day's end pour out again just as quickly, draining from the great bowl in a matter of minutes. The Romans, who organized everything, had organized even this, the movement of 50,000 people, with a care that modern builders of great arenas still study and admire. Let us linger a moment on the genius of its design, for the Colosseum was not only large but cunningly made, and its builders solved problems that engineers would wrestle with for 2,000 years afterward. Consider first the simple matter of how it stands at all. A building of such height and weight, a great ring of stone rising tier upon tier presses down upon the earth with an enormous load, and the ground beneath the heart of Rome was soft, marshy in places, the bed of that drained lake. The builders met this by laying down a vast foundation of concrete, a great ring-shaped raft of stones sunk deep into the earth, broad enough and strong enough to bear the whole tremendous weight and spread it evenly across the yielding ground. Upon this hidden base the visible building rose, and so well was it made that after nearly 2,000 years, after earthquakes and quarrying and the slow erosion of the ages, the greater part of it still stands. Consider, too, the great curving outer wall, with its rows of arches climbing one above another. The Romans had learned, better than any people before them, the secret of the arch, that a curve of wedge-shaped stones, each pressing against its neighbors, could carry an immense weight and span a wide opening without breaking. By stacking arch upon arch, they could raise a structure to a great height, light and open and pierced with many doorways, yet strong enough to hold the weight of 50,000 people and all the masonry of the upper tiers. The columns that framed each arch were of three different orders, the plainer and sturdier styles below, the more slender and ornate above, rising from heavy strength at the base to lighter grace at the top, a thing pleasing to the eye and sound in its engineering both at once. It was a building that taught the world how such things should be done. For centuries afterward, when men wished to build something grand and strong and beautiful, they looked back to the arches of the Colosseum. Inside, the seating rose in steep tiers around the central arena, and where you sat depended on who you were, for Rome was a society of careful ranks, and the Colosseum mirrored it exactly. Nearest the arena, in the place of honor, sat the emperor and the senators and the priests and the great men of the city, on broad marble seats, sheltered and close to the action. Above them sat the ordinary citizens, the men of the middling sort, on stone benches. Higher still sat the poor and the foreigners, and at the very top, in the steepest and most distant tier, the women and the slaves, far above the arena, looking down upon the small, bright figures far below. The whole society of Rome was gathered there, stacked from top to bottom in its proper order, every man and woman in their appointed place. And in the center of it all lay the arena itself, an oval floor of timber covered with sand. The very word arena comes from the Latin word for sand was spread across the floor to soak up what was spilled there. It is one of the harder truths of this beautiful building that it was made for spectacles of blood. Let us speak of this gently and plainly, for it is part of the story, and then let us move past it toward kinder things. The Romans gathered in the Colosseum to watch contests of combat. The most famous of these were the fights of the gladiators, trained fighters, most of them slaves or prisoners or condemned men, though some were free men who chose the life for its fame and its winnings. These men were schooled in special academies, fed and trained and cared for like prized athletes, and then sent out to fight one another before the roaring crowd, armed and armored in many different styles, so that each kind of fighter had his own weapons and his own way of battle. The crowd had its favorites, as crowds always do, and cheered them by name, and a great champion of the arena could win fame across the whole city, his image painted on walls, his name on every tongue. Some gladiators won their freedom in the end, and lived out their days as free men, retired heroes of the sand. There were other spectacles too, hunts of wild beasts brought from the far corners of the empire, lions and leopards and bears and elephants and creatures the Romans had scarcely seen before, displayed and pursued before the astonished crowd. There were grand reenactments of famous battles and legends, the arena flooded, some said, to stage mock sea fights upon its waters. The emperors who staged these games spent fortunes upon them, for the favor of the people was a thing worth buying, and a generous show in the Colosseum was a gift from the ruler to his city, a way of binding the crowd to him in gratitude and delight. This was the darker side of Rome, this appetite for spectacle and for blood, and it is right that we do not look away from it entirely. But it is also true that for most of the people who climbed those 80 staircases on a festival morning, the day was something else, a holiday, a great public gathering, a chance to escape the cramped and noisy streets and sit beneath the awning among their fellow citizens, to see and be seen, to share in the vast common life of the city. Let us turn now to the human warmth of the crowd, for it is a gentler thing to carry towards sleep. Imagine the morning of a great spectacle. Since before dawn the people have been streaming toward the Colosseum from every quarter of the city, down the narrow streets, across the open squares, a river of humanity flowing toward the great stone ring. They carry cushions to soften the hard benches and food wrapped in cloth, and they call to their friends and neighbors as they go. At the gates, they show their tokens and pass through the numbered arches into the cool shadow of the interior, and climb the stairs and emerge at last into the great open bowl, blinking in the brightness, finding their places among the gathering thousands. And then the long day unfolds. The awning is drawn across against the climbing sun. Vendors move through the crowd selling food and drink, bread and sausages and cups of wine. People gossip and argue and lay wagers and share their lunches. Children sit on their father's shoulders. Old friends meet who have not seen each other in months. The emperor arrives to a great roar and takes his place of honor, and the whole vast crowd, 50,000 strong, becomes for a day a single living thing, breathing and murmuring and crying out together, sharing one enormous experience beneath the Roman sky. This was the true magic of the Colosseum, perhaps not the blood on the sand, but the gathering itself, the way it drew the whole city into one place and made of all those separate lives a single crowd. For a poor man of Rome, crowded all year into a dark rented room in a tall and dangerous tenement, the games were a gift of light and space and belonging a day when he sat, however high up, in the same great building as the emperor himself, sharing the same spectacle, part of the same Rome. Let us pause and think for a moment about the great awning, that roof of sailcloth drawn across the open sky, for it is one of the most remarkable and least imagined features of the whole building. Around the very top of the outer wall, set into the stone, ran a ring of sockets, and into these sockets were fitted tall wooden masts, hundreds of them, standing up around the rim of the Colosseum like the masts of a fleet. From these masts, a vast system of ropes and pulleys could draw out a great canopy of canvas, segment by segment, until much of the open bowl was shaded from the burning Roman sun. To work this enormous sail required men who knew ropes and rigging as no others did, and so the task was given to sailors of the imperial fleet, brought from the great naval harbors to the heart of the city, where they swarmed over the upper galleries and hauled upon the lines and spread the canopy across the sky above the crowd. Picture it, the white cloth billowing and tautening overhead, the sunlight filtering through it in a soft and shifting glow, the great crowd sitting cool in the shade while the day blazed beyond the rim. It was a marvel of its own, a moving roof above an open building, and it speaks of the boundless ingenuity and the boundless ambition of the people who made the Colosseum. And let us think too of the great festivals for which all this machinery was made to work, the games that could stretch on for many days together, given by an emperor to mark a victory, or the dedication of the building, or simply to win the love of the people. When the Colosseum was first opened, the histories tell us, the celebrations lasted 100 days, a vast and continuous outpouring of spectacle such as the world had never seen. For day after day the people gathered, and the awning was drawn, and the arena below was given over to one wonder after another. To stage such things, the whole apparatus of the empire was set in motion. Animals gathered from 3 continents and shipped across the seas, fighters trained for months in the great schools, machinery built and tested, food and water laid in for the enormous crowds. The Colosseum on such days was the beating heart of the whole Roman world, the place where the wealth and the reach and the organizing genius of the empire were gathered together and poured out in a single dazzling display. Now let us think of the building itself and of the long centuries it has endured. The Colosseum was built in only about 8 years, an astonishing feat for so vast a structure, raised by the labor of thousands of workers, and it is said by the toil of captives taken in the wars in the East, whose plunder helped to pay for it. It was built of stone and brick and concrete, that wonderful Roman concrete that we shall hear more of, and faced with gleaming pale travertine stone quarried from the hills nearby and brought to the city along a specially built road. Within its walls and beneath its floor ran a hidden world of passages and chambers and lifting machines, a whole underground complex where the beasts were caged and the fighters waited in great wooden elevators, worked by ropes and pulleys and the muscle of many men, could raise animals and scenery up through trapdoors into the arena above. Even beneath the sand, the Colosseum was a marvel of engineering. Let us go down in the imagination into that hidden world beneath the arena, for it is one of the most remarkable parts of the whole building, and few who watched the games above ever saw it. Below the wooden floor of the arena, out of sight of the crowd, lay a vast complex of underground passages and chambers, 2 stories deep in places, a labyrinth of brick corridors running the whole length and breadth of the oval. Here was the machinery that made the spectacles possible. Here were the cages where the wild beasts waited in the dark, lions and bears and leopards, hearing the muffled roar of the crowd far above. Here were the cells where the fighters made ready. And here, ranged along the passages, were the great wooden elevators, platforms that could be raised by ropes and counterweights and the straining muscles of teams of men, lifting a caged animal or a piece of scenery up through a trapdoor in the arena floor, so that a beast might appear suddenly in the bright arena as if from nowhere, springing up into the light before the astonished crowd. Dozens of these lifts could be worked at once, and the trapdoors opened all across the floor, so that the arena could be transformed in moments, filled with animals or scenery rising as if by magic from below. It was a place of darkness and toil and sweat, that underground world, a place of caged beasts and waiting men and laboring slaves, hidden beneath the gleaming spectacle above, much as the hard machinery of any great show is hidden behind its bright face. And it is strange and a little moving to walk there now, in the ruins, along those exposed brick passages, open to the sky since the wooden floor above them rotted away long ago, and to imagine the noise and the heat and the fear and the labor that once filled them, beneath the roar of 50,000 voices. For 4 centuries and more the games went on, until at last the Roman world changed, and its tastes changed with it, and the spectacles of the arena fell silent. The empire declined, as we shall hear, and the great building was used and abused and slowly damaged by the long passage of time. Earthquakes shook it and cracked its mighty walls. Later generations, no longer able to build as the Romans had, treated it as a quarry, carrying off its stone to raise their own churches and palaces, so that for centuries it stood half-stripped, a wounded giant in the heart of a shrunken city. And yet it never fell. Battered, plundered, broken open on one side, it endured, too vast and too strong to be wholly destroyed, until at last a wiser age learned to cherish and protect it. There is a strange and moving irony in this long survival, worth pausing over as the evening deepens. The Colosseum was built to be a place of crowds and noise and motion, the most crowded place in the most crowded city in the world, alive with 50,000 voices, and it has become, in the end, the very opposite, a place of stillness, of emptiness, of quiet reflection. The throngs that built it and filled it are 2,000 years gone, every one of them, the emperors and the senators and the poor men in the high tiers, the gladiators and the vendors and the children on their fathers' shoulders, all of them long since turned to dust. And the building they made to hold them outlived them all, and stands now in the silence they left behind, holding only the memory of their gathering. To walk through it today is to feel that silence almost as a presence, the great absence where a million lives once pressed together. The stones remember what the people have forgotten. And there is something gentle in that thought, something that belongs to the quiet of the evening. All the urgency of that ancient world, all its passion and its cruelty and its delight, all the things that seemed to the people of that day so vital and so pressing have softened now into stillness, into the calm of a ruin glowing in the evening light. The roar has faded to silence. The blood has long since washed away. What remains is only the beauty of the old stone and the peace of the passing centuries, and the swifts wheeling in the golden air above the broken arches, as they have wheeled for 2,000 years. And so it stands today, after nearly 2,000 years, the most famous ruin in the world, visited by millions, its great broken arches glowing golden in the evening light. It has outlasted the gladiators and the emperors and the empire that built it. The crowds that fill it now come not to watch men die, but simply to marvel, to stand within that vast oval and imagine the roar of 50,000 voices, long ago fallen silent. Let us stand there now in the empty arena in the soft light of evening. The crowd is gone, the awning is furled, the benches rise around us, silent, holding the memory of all those gathered thousands. A breath of wind stirs the dust across the old stones. The swifts wheel and cry around the broken upper tiers as they have for centuries, and the golden light moves slowly down the curving walls as the sun sets behind the hills of Rome. It is very quiet now. All the noise and the blood and the glory have faded into the long stillness of the past, the way the noise of a great crowd fades when at last everyone has gone home. And you, who have walked through it all, can let it go now and rest in the quiet that came after, the deep and gentle quiet of the empty arena beneath the evening sky. Rest now, the games are over and the crowd has gone home, and the great stone ring keeps its watch over the sleeping city. Sleep well. Tonight, let us travel together to the far northern edge of the Roman world, to a windswept country of green hills and gray skies, where the greatest empire of the ancient age drew a line across the land and said, "Here and no further." You will walk along that line slowly in the soft light of a clouded evening in no hurry at all. There is nothing here you need to keep watch over, no border you must hold. You can let the words drift over you like mist moving across the hills, and let yourself sink, gently and willingly, towards sleep. This is the story of the Roman legions, and of the great wall they built at the edge of the world. Picture, if you will, the Empire of Rome at its widest, stretching across 3 continents, holding within its borders peoples of every tongue and color, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germany, from the mountains of Spain to the rivers of the East. To rule so vast a world, and to hold it together against all who would break it apart, Rome relied above all upon one thing, its army. And the heart of that army was the legion. Let us speak first of the legions, for they were the iron frame upon which the whole empire was built. A Roman legion was a body of some 5,000 men, and it was unlike any army the ancient world had seen. It was not a mass of warriors fighting each for his own glory, but a single disciplined machine, trained to move and fight as one. The soldiers of the legion were professionals, men who served for many years, often for half their lives, drilled and disciplined until obedience became second nature. They marched together, camped together, fought together, shoulder to shoulder behind their great curved shields, advancing in ordered ranks at the command of their officers. It was this discipline, more than any weapon, that made them so formidable. Other peoples might be braver or fiercer or more numerous, but few could match the cold, patient, unbreakable order of a Roman legion in the field. Each legionary carried a heavy load. There was his armor of overlapping iron plates, light and flexible, that he wore over a tunic. There was his great shield, curved to wrap around his body. There were his weapons, a short stabbing sword, deadly in the close press of battle, and a pair of heavy javelins to hurl at the enemy before the lines met. And beyond his fighting gear, the Roman soldier carried on the march an astonishing burden of tools and supplies. A saw, an axe, a basket, a pickaxe, rations of grain, a cooking pot, stakes for building a fort. The Romans joked that their soldiers carried their whole household on their backs, for the legionary was not only a fighter but a laborer, an engineer, a builder. This is a thing worth dwelling on, for it surprises those who think of armies only as instruments of war. The Roman soldier spent far more of his life building than fighting. Wherever the legions went, they built. Every night on the march, an army on campaign would halt and raise a fortified camp, digging a ditch and a rampart and pitching their tents in neat ordered rows, a temporary fortress thrown up in a few hours and abandoned the next morning. And where the legions settled for longer, they built in stone, great permanent fortresses and the roads that linked them, and bridges and harbors and walls. The army was Rome's great engine of construction, and much of the lasting work of the empire, the very roads and structures we still admire, was raised by the hands of soldiers. Let us linger a little on the life of the ordinary soldier, for to understand the legions is to understand the men who filled them, and theirs was a hard and a settled and a strangely orderly life. A man who joined the legion signed away a great span of his years, often 25 of them, a quarter century of service before he might lay down his arms and retire. In exchange, he received a regular wage, paid in coin 3 times a year, and his food and his equipment, and a place in a great brotherhood of men. The legion was his family now, more than the family he had left behind. He ate with his tent mates, a small group of soldiers who shared a tent on the march and a room in the barracks, who cooked together and slept together and fought side by side, bound by a loyalty as deep as in blood. The day was governed by routine. The morning roll call, the drills, the work details, the watches, the endless training that kept the legion sharp even in years of peace. For the Romans understood that an army grows soft in idleness, and so they kept their soldiers always at work, marching and building and practicing with weighted weapons, so that real battle, when it came, would seem lighter than the training. And the discipline of the legion was famously severe. A soldier who failed in his duty might be flogged, or fined, or fed on barley instead of wheat like a beast, or in the worst cases put to death. There was an old and terrible punishment rarely used for a unit that had shown cowardice, in which 1 man in every 10 was chosen by lot and killed by his own comrades, a punishment so dreaded that its very name has come down to us as a word for ruthless color. But against this harshness stood great rewards: plunder taken in war, gifts of money from a generous emperor, decorations for valor worn with fierce pride, promotion through the ranks, and at the end of it all, for the man who survived his long service, a grant of land or sum of money to begin his life anew. Many a common soldier rose to become a centurion, a hardened officer of long experience, the true backbone of a legion, and some rose higher still. It was a hard life, but it was also, for a poor man of the provinces, a road upward, a way into the great machine of Rome, and all the security and standing that came with it. Let us follow the legions, then, to the very edge of their world, to a cold green island at the empire's farthest northwest reach, to the island the Romans called Britannia, to the place we now call Britain. Rome had conquered the southern part of this island and made it a province, with towns and roads and villas in the Roman style. But in the north, the country grew wilder, the hills higher and bleaker, and there dwelt peoples whom the Romans never fully subdued, fierce tribes of the far north who raided across the frontier and could not be brought to heel. The Roman armies marched against them again and again, winning battles but never lasting peace, for the land was hard and the people unbowed, and beyond every hill lay another hill and another tribe, and a country that swallowed armies and gave nothing back. And so at last the Romans made a decision that revealed much about the empire in its mature years. Rather than push endlessly onward into that cold and unprofitable north, they would draw a line and hold it. They would mark the edge of their world with a wall. The emperor who ordered this was named Hadrian, a thoughtful and far-traveled ruler who spent much of his reign journeying across the empire, inspecting its frontiers and strengthening its defenses. He came to Britain and looked upon its troubled northern border, and he commanded that a great wall be built clear across the island from one sea to the other to divide the Roman world from the barbarians beyond and to control who passed in and out. We call it after him Hadrian's Wall. Let us walk along it now in the imagination in the gray light of a northern day. It ran for some 80 Roman miles, from coast to coast across the narrow neck of the island, over hill and valley and crag, following the high ground wherever it could. In its main stretches it was a wall of stone, broad enough to walk along the top, rising well above the height of a man, and in front of it ran a deep ditch, and behind it a road for the swift movement of troops. At regular intervals along its length stood small fortlets, one for roughly every Roman mile, where a handful of soldiers kept watch and where gates allowed travelers and traders to pass through under the eyes of the guards. And between these malfortlets stood pairs of turrets, watchtowers from which sentries could survey the land to the north. At greater intervals stood the larger forts, full garrisons of soldiers, who lived along the wall with their workshops and their granaries, and in time, the little civilian towns that grew up around them. Imagine standing upon that wall on a gray northern morning. The wind comes cold and steady off the hills, carrying the smell of heather and wet earth and wood smoke from the fort behind you. The land rolls away to the north, green and brown and empty, the hills fading into mist, the country of the unconquered tribes. Below you, the ditch is full of dark water. The stone beneath your feet is damp and cold. And along the wall, in both directions, you can see the line of it marching away over the crags, turret after turret, fort after fort, vanishing at last into the gray distance, the whole great work of stone snaking across the spine of the land like something out of a dream. Now think of the men who held it. They were not, for the most part, men of Italy, these soldiers of the northern wall. For by this time the army of Rome was drawn from every corner of the empire, and the troops who garrisoned the frontier of Britain came from far away, from the lands along the great river of Germany, from the coasts of the cold northern sea, from Spain, from the Balkans, even from the deserts of the east. There were archers from Syria stationed in the cold mists of Britain, and men from the marshes of the Low Countries, and Spaniards and Gauls, all of them now soldiers of Rome, all of them serving the empire on its farthest edge. They had been recruited from their homelands, trained in the Roman way, and posted to this distant frontier, where they spent their years of service watching the north and keeping the peace of the wall. We know a remarkable amount about the daily lives of these men, more than you might expect, because at one of the forts along the frontier, the cold, wet ground preserved hundreds of thin wooden writing tablets, scraps of everyday correspondence buried and forgotten for nearly 2,000 years. And on these tablets in faded ink, we can read the small, ordinary words of the soldiers and their families, words that reach across all those centuries and touch us with their humanity. There are requests for supplies and reports on the strength of units and accounts of grain and beer and food. There is a letter inviting a friend to a birthday party, one of the oldest such invitations ever found, written by one officer's wife to another. There are mentions of warm socks and underclothes sent from home, for the cold of the northern winters was hard on men from warmer lands. There are notes about who is sick and who is on leave, and the small daily business of a community of soldiers living together at the edge of the world. These tablets bring the wall to life as no rune ever could, for they remind us that the frontier was not only a line of stone and a place of war, but a place where people lived, ate and drank, wrote letters, celebrated birthdays, complained of the cold, missed their friends, raised their children in the little towns that grew up beside the forts. The grim gray wall was somebody's home. Whole lives were lived along it, lives full of the same small joys and troubles that fill any life in any age. And for the most part, those lives were peaceful. The Great Wall in the end was less a battlefield than a boundary, a place of customs posts and patrols and quiet watching, where most days passed without violence, where the chief business was not war but the slow, ordinary keeping of order. Travelers and traders passed through its gates, going north and south, paying their tolls, watched by the guards. The soldiers drilled and built and repaired, kept their watches, drew their pay, and waited out their long years of service until they could retire, often settling near the wall they had guarded, marrying local women, becoming part of the country they had been sent to hold. Let us think for a while about why such a wall was built at all, for it tells us something important about Rome and its maturity, something that touches the deeper story of the whole empire. There had been a time in the days of the Republic and the early emperors when Rome seemed to grow without limit, swallowing kingdom after kingdom, pushing its borders ever outward, as though it might one day rule the whole of the earth. But an empire cannot grow forever. There comes a point at which the cost of conquering and holding new lands grows greater than the worth of the lands themselves, when the armies are stretched too thin and the frontiers too long, and the wise course is no longer to expand but to consolidate, to draw a firm line and hold what one has. Hadrian understood this. He was not a conqueror by temperament but a consolidator, a man who traveled the empire not to enlarge it but to strengthen it, to set its house in order, to mark and fortify its edges. The wall was the very emblem of this new and soberer age, not a spear thrust outward but a shield held steady, a declaration that here the growth of Rome would stop and here its strength would be gathered and held. And there is a kind of wisdom in that, a maturity that comes to empires as it comes to people, the wisdom of knowing one's limits and being content within them. The wall said, "This is enough. This is the edge of what we will hold. Beyond lies a country we do not need and will not take, and we will not pour out our strength forever chasing." There is a quiet dignity in such a decision, a turning from restless ambition towards steady keeping, and the long peace that the wall helped to hold along the northern frontier was its reward. Generations of soldiers and farmers and traders living out their lives in safety behind its stones. For nearly 300 years the wall stood and was manned, generation after generation of soldiers keeping their watch upon the cold green hills. It was repaired and rebuilt, and at times abandoned and reoccupied as the fortunes of the empire rose and fell. But in the end, as Rome itself weakened and drew in its strength from the distant edges, the soldiers were withdrawn and the wall was left to the wind and the rain, the forts empty, the watchtowers fell silent, the little towns faded. And the great wall, no longer manned, settled slowly into the landscape, its stones tumbling, grass growing over its ramparts, until it became what it is today, a long line of gray ruins striding across the hills of northern Britain, one of the most evocative monuments the Romans ever left. Let us think before we leave the wall of how strange and how moving a thing it is that it was built at all, this line of stone drawn clear across an island at the very edge of the known world. To the men who served upon it, far from the warm lands of their birth, the wall must have seemed the very end of everything, the last outpost of the ordered world, beyond which lay only the wild hills and the unconquered tribes and the cold gray unknown. A soldier from the sunlit shores of the Mediterranean, posted to this misty frontier, stood at the literal edge of a civilization, looking out over a country his empire had decided not to take. And yet here, even here, Rome built as Rome always built, in stone and order, with milestones and bathhouses and writing tablets and birthday parties, carrying its whole way of life to the farthest place it reached, planting gardens and lighting hearths and keeping records of the rim of the world. There is something deeply human in that, something that touches us across the centuries. the way people make a home even in the loneliest of places, the way they bring their small comforts and their daily routines and their letters from far away even to the cold end of everything, and make of a grim frontier a place where life, ordinary warm human life, could be lived. And then in time they let it go. When the strength of the empire drew in, the order came at last for the soldiers to leave, and the long watch upon the northern wall came quietly to its end. We do not know the day or the manner of it, whether the last garrisons marched away in good order or simply drifted off as the pace stopped coming and the world beyond fell into confusion. But one day the wall stood empty, the watchtowers untenanted, the gates unguarded, the great line of stone left at last to the wind and the sheep in the slow centuries. The frontier that the legions had held for 300 years was simply abandoned, and the tribes to the north, who had pressed against it for so long, found one day that there was no longer anyone there to press against. The watch was over. The empire had gone home. It is still there. You can walk it now mile after mile over the high wild country and stand where the sentry stood and look north over the same empty hills they watched and feel the same cold wind off the same gray distance. The empire that built it is long gone, dissolved into the mists of history, but its wall remains, patient and enduring, tracing across the land the farthest reach of Rome. Let us stand there one last time as the gray day fades toward evening. The wind is dropping now. Mist gathers in the hollows. The hills go soft and dim in the failing light, and the long line of the wall grows faint, melting into the dusk. Somewhere a curlew calls, far off and lonely, and then falls silent. The watchfires that once burned along the frontier are long cold, and there is no enemy in the north anymore, and no one keeps the watch, and there is nothing at all now to guard against. You can set down the watch too, though. There is no border to hold tonight, no frontier to defend. The wall keeps its own long vigil over the empty hills, and you are safe and warm and far from any danger. Let the mist gather softly around you, and the wind drop away to nothing, and the green hills fade gently into the dark. Rest now at the quiet edge of the world. Sleep well. Tonight, let us travel together to a busy harbor at the mouth of the river, where the brown water of the Tiber meets the blue of the sea, and where for centuries the ships of the whole known world came laden to feed the greatest city ever built. We will wander its quiet streets slowly, in the warm gold of a late afternoon, in no hurry to be anywhere. There is nothing here you need to load or unload, no cargo you must count. You can let the words move over you like the gentle lap of water against a wharf, and let yourself drift slowly down towards sleep. This is the story of Ostia, the port of Rome. Picture, if you will, the city of Rome at the height of the empire, a vast and crowded place of nearly 1 million souls, far larger than any city the world had seen before. Such a city could not feed itself. The fields of Italy could not begin to fill so many mouths, and so the food that kept Rome alive, above all the grain that was baked into the bread that fed the multitude, had to be brought from far across the sea, from the rich farmlands of Africa and Egypt and Sicily. It came by ship in enormous quantities, season after season, year after year, an endless flow of grain and oil and wine and every kind of good, flowing toward the hungry city. And it nearly all came in through one place, through Ostia. Ostia lay at the mouth of the Tiber, where the river that ran through Rome at last reached the sea, some 20 miles or so downstream from the city. Its very name comes from the Latin word for mouth, for it sat at the mouth of the river. In the earliest days it had been a small settlement, founded, the Romans said, to guard the river mouth and to work the salt pans of the coast, where seawater was let into shallow ponds and dried to leave the precious salt behind. But as Rome grew great, Ostia grew with it, swelling from a little frontier town into the bustling gateway through which the wealth of the world poured into the capital. Let us walk into it, then, in the days of its glory. Ostia in its prime was a thriving town of perhaps 50,000 people, crowded with warehouses and apartment blocks and temples and baths, its streets paved with great flat stones, worn smooth by the passage of countless feet and cartwheels. It had the look of a smaller, busier, more workmanlike Rome, for it was in many ways Rome's working twin, the place where the unglamorous labor of feeding the capital was carried out. Here were no grand imperial palaces, but instead the practical buildings of trade, the warehouses where goods were stored, the offices where merchants struck their bargains, the lodgings where the workers and sailors and traders lived. Down by the water lay the harbor, and this was the heart of it all. Picture the riverbank crowded with ships, the masts standing thick as a forest, the great merchant vessels riding low in the water under their heavy cargoes. These were not warships, slim and swift, but broad-bellied freighters, built to carry as much as possible across the sea, their holds packed with grain or great jars of oil and wine. They had come from across the whole Mediterranean, from Egypt and Africa and Spain and the eastern shores, braving the open sea to bring their cargoes to the mouth of the Tiber. And here a difficulty must be told, for it shaped the whole life of the port. The mouth of the Tiber was not a good natural harbor. The river carried down great quantities of mud and silt, which it spread across the coast, making the water shallow and treacherous, and the largest grain ships, the giants of the merchant fleet, could not safely come into the riverbank at all. They had to anchor offshore in the open sea, exposed to the wind and the waves, and their cargoes had to be carried in to land by smaller boats, a slow and dangerous business. In stormy weather, ships were wrecked and grain was lost, and the supply of the city hung always upon the uncertain mercy of the sea. And so the emperors of Rome, who understood that the feeding of the capital was a matter of life and death, undertook one of the great engineering works of the ancient world. They built, just up the coast from Ostia, a vast artificial harbor, an enormous basin scooped out of the land and enclosed by great curving breakwaters reaching out into the sea, with a lighthouse rising at its mouth to guide the ships in by night. Within this sheltered water, the largest vessels could ride safely at anchor, protected from the storms, and unload their cargoes onto the wharves. And when even this great harbor proved to silt up and grow rough in bad weather, a later emperor built a second basin behind the first, a great hexagonal harbor of still water, ringed with warehouses, linked to the river and so to Rome by canals. From the air, the outline of that hexagonal harbor can still be traced today, a six-sided pool, long since cut off from the sea, lying quiet in the Italian countryside, a ghost of the great port that once was. Let us pause and picture the great grain ships themselves, for they were among the largest vessels of the ancient world, and to imagine one riding at anchor is to feel the scale of the trade that fed Rome. The biggest of them were enormous, broad and deep and heavy, able to carry 1,000 tons of grain or more in a single voyage, with crews of dozens and great square sails that caught the Mediterranean wind. We have an account written by a traveler of the ancient world of one such grain ship that was blown off course and put in at a harbor in Greece, and the people came down to the shore to marvel at it as at a wonder, so vast did it seem to them, longer than many a public building, its mast as tall as a tower. To sail such a ship from Egypt to Italy was a voyage of weeks, dependent wholly upon the wind and the season, for the ancients did not sail the open sea in winter when the storms were too fierce, and so the grain trade had its rhythm, the fleet sailing in the warm months, racing to bring in the harvest before the seas closed, then waiting out the winter in port. And picture the moment of arrival, the great ship at last raising the coast of Italy after its long passage, the lighthouse of the harbor coming into view, the crew weary and salt-stained and glad, the precious cargo safe in the hold. There were officials waiting to inspect it and measure it and record it, for the grain that fed Rome was carefully accounted, much of it gathered as tax from the provinces and distributed to the people of the city, a great part of it given away free or sold cheaply to keep the multitude fed and content. Upon the safe arrival of these fleets depended the peace of the capital, for a hungry city was a dangerous city, and the emperors knew it. The whole vast apparatus of the port, the harbors and the warehouses and the armies of workers, existed for this above all, to make sure that the bread never failed, that the people of Rome woke each morning to a city that could feed them. Through these harbors flowed the lifeblood of Rome. Let us think for a moment of the sheer scale of it, for it is staggering. The city of Rome consumed every year hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, enough to fill thousands of shiploads. This grain was brought across the sea in great fleets, especially from Egypt, whose harvest had fed the ancient world for thousands of years and now fed Rome. The grain fleet from Egypt was so vital that its safe arrival was watched for anxiously each year, and its coming was greeted with relief and celebration, for upon it depended the bread of the people, and grain was only the beginning. There came also oil, the olive oil that Romans used for cooking and lighting and washing, brought in great pottery jars from Spain and Africa, in such quantities that the broken shards of the discarded jars, piled up over the centuries, formed an actual hill in Rome, a mountain of broken pottery that still stands today. There came wine and fish sauce, and marble and timber and metals, and wild animals for the games, and slaves and luxuries from the farthest east, spices and silks and gems that had traveled half the world to reach the markets of the capital. All of this passed through Ostia, and so the town was filled day and night with the labor of handling it. Let us walk among that labor now in the warm afternoon. The wharves are crowded with workers, the porters who carried the cargoes ashore, bent under sacks of grain or rolling the great jars of oil, sweating in the sun, calling to one another as they worked. There are the warehouses, the long buildings where the goods were stored, room after room of grain and oil and wine, guarded and counted and recorded. There are the offices of the merchants and the shipping guilds, the men who organized this great trade, the importers and the captains and the brokers. In the heart of the town lay a square ring with the small offices of these trading companies and guilds, and before each office, set into the pavement in black and white mosaic, was a little picture and an inscription announcing what that company did and where it came from. A ship, a lighthouse, a measuring vessel for grain, the name of a distant port. You can still see these mosaics today, in the ruins of that square, the trademarks of merchants dead for 2,000 years, advertising the trade of a vanished world. Let us think for a moment of the great warehouses of Ostia, for they were the very purpose of the town, and to picture them is to feel the scale of the trade that flowed through it. These were not small storerooms, but great buildings, ranged in rows near the harbor and along the river, built around open courtyards and lined with row upon row of storage rooms, sturdy and well-made, for they held the wealth and the food of the world. The grain warehouses were specially built to keep their precious contents dry and sound, their floors raised on low pillars so that air could flow beneath and keep the grain from rotting, their walls thick against the damp. Into these warehouses flowed the cargoes of 1,000 ships, and here the grain and the oil and the wine waited, counted and guarded and recorded, until they could be loaded onto the smaller boats and barges that carried them up the river to Rome. The whole town was, in a sense, the larder of the capital, the place where the food of 1 million people was gathered and held and passed along, and the great warehouses were its heart. And let us picture the river itself, the brown Tiber winding the 20 miles up to Rome, for upon it depended the last stage of that long journey from the fields of Egypt and Africa to the tables of the capital. The great sea ships could not go up the shallow, winding river, and so their cargoes were transferred at Ostia to smaller vessels, barges that were towed upstream against the current by teams of oxen, or by gangs of men hauling on ropes along the banks, walking the long miles beside the slow brown water, dragging the laden boats up to the city. It was hard and patient labor, this final haul, and it went on day after day, year after year, an endless procession of barges creeping up the river toward Rome, bearing the food that kept the great city alive. Without it, Rome would have starved. And so this quiet brown river and the patient men and beasts that hauled the barges along it were as much a part of the lifeline of the empire as the great fleets that crossed the open sea. For Ostia, you see, has not entirely vanished. Unlike most ancient cities, it was not built over by a later town. When Rome declined and the great trade dwindled and the harbors choked with silt, Ostia was slowly abandoned, its people drifting away, until it stood empty and was covered over by the sand and the river mud and forgotten. And there it lay, buried and preserved for many centuries, until it was dug out again in modern times. And so Ostia today is one of the most complete ancient towns we have, a place where you can walk down real Roman streets, between the walls of real Roman houses and shops and warehouses, and feel, more vividly than almost anywhere, what it was like to live in an ordinary Roman town. Let us wander those streets a little, then, in the gold of the late afternoon, and see how its people lived. They lived, many of them, in apartment blocks, tall buildings of brick several stories high, divided into many separate dwellings, much like the apartment houses of a modern city. The well-to-do had spacious rooms on the lower floors, with painted walls and mosaic floors, while the poorer crowded into smaller rooms higher up. On the ground floors of these buildings, opening onto the street, were shops and workshops and taverns, just as in a city today. There were bakeries with their great stone mills for grinding the grain and their ovens for baking the bread. There were taverns where a working man could buy a cup of wine and a hot meal, their counters set with sunken jars to hold food and drink, their walls painted with cheerful scenes. There were public latrines, long benches of stone with running water beneath, where people sat side by side in unembarrassed company. And there were the baths, those great institutions of Roman life, where people of every rank came to bathe and exercise and meet their friends and pass the time, soaking in the warm water beneath vaulted ceilings, scraping the oil and dust from their skin, talking and laughing in the steam. Let us linger among the people of the port a little longer, for they were a mixed and varied folk, and the streets of Ostia must have been among the most cosmopolitan in all the ancient world. Here came sailors and merchants from every shore of the Mediterranean, men of many tongues and many gods, mingling in the taverns and along the wharves. There were Egyptians and Syrians and Greeks, Africans and Spaniards and Gauls, each bringing something of their own homeland to the bustling town. They brought their goods, but they brought also their gods, and so Ostia was filled with temples and shrines to deities from across the world. The old gods of Rome and the gods of the East, and mysterious cults brought by sailors and soldiers from distant lands, worshipped in secret underground chambers by men sworn to silence. A man walking the streets of the port might pass, in a single afternoon, the temple of a Roman god, the shrine of an Egyptian goddess whose worship had spread across the empire, and the hidden meeting place of an Eastern cult, all of them thriving side by side in the crowded, tolerant trading town. And the work of the port bound these many people together into a great web of guilds and associations, for the Romans loved to organize themselves into such bodies. There were guilds of the boatmen who ferried cargo up the river, and guilds of the porters who carried it, and guilds of the grain measurers and the rope makers, and the divers who recovered goods from sunken ships. These guilds were not only working bodies, but social ones. They held feasts and funerals, they had their own meeting halls and their own patron gods, they looked after their members and buried them with honor when they died. To belong to such a guild was to have a place in the life of the town, a family of fellow workers, a society that gave dignity and belonging to the humble labor of the docks. In the ruins of Ostia, we can still read the names of these guilds, carved in stone, and trace the little world of mutual help and shared pride that the working people of the port built for themselves. Was, in short, a real and living town, full of the ordinary business of ordinary lives, working and trading and eating and bathing, raising families, worshipping the gods in the many temples, burying the dead in the tombs that lined the roads outside the walls. It was not a place of emperors and grand history, but a place of merchants and porters and shopkeepers and sailors, the sort of people who never make it into the great histories, but who made up the true and beating life of the Roman world. It is worth pausing, too, on the great public baths of Ostia, for they were among the finest buildings of the town in the very heart of its social life. To us, who think of bathing as a private and a hurried thing, it is strange to imagine how central the baths were to a Roman's day. A man would go to the baths in the afternoon when his work was done, and there he would find not merely a place to wash, but a whole world of leisure. A courtyard for exercise where he might toss a ball or lift weights or simply stroll. A series of bathing rooms leading from the cold plunge to the warm room to the hot steam room, heated by furnaces whose warmth flowed beneath the floors and through the walls in hollow channels, a cunning system that kept the great rooms warm in every season. And everywhere the company of his fellow townsmen, talking and laughing and doing business and gossiping in the steam. The baths of Ostia were paved with mosaics, some of which survive, showing sea gods and dolphins and tritons riding the waves, fitting decoration for a town that lived by the sea. To bathe in such a place in the warmth and the murmur and the company was one of the great ordinary pleasures of Roman life, and it was open to nearly everyone, rich and poor alike, for the cost of entry was small. Here, more than anywhere, the people of the port came together, set down the cares of the day, and let the warm water and the warm company ease them. And now, like Rome itself, it is quiet. Let us stand in it one last time as the day ends. The sun is low now, gold and warm, slanting down the empty streets, casting long shadows from the broken walls. The wharves where the porters labored are still. The warehouses stand empty, their doorways open to the evening air. The square of the merchants is silent, its mosaics glowing softly in the last light, the little ships and lighthouses still advertising their trade to no one. A breath of wind moves through the ruined apartment blocks, stirring the grass that grows now in the old rooms. Far off, the sea lies calm and gold, and the river moves on toward it, slow and brown and patient, the same river that bore those two infants long ago, and bore the grain of empires, and bears now only the quiet of evening. The great trade is finished, the ships have all come in and unloaded and sailed away into the past. There is nothing left to carry, nothing to count, nothing to do at all. The port has done its long labor and earned its long rest, and lies now in the warm gold of the endless evening, dreaming of the ships that filled its harbor when the world was young. You can rest there too now in the quiet of the old port, with the lap of the water and the warmth of the fading sun and the long shadows soft across the ancient streets. There is nowhere you need to be, and nothing you need to carry, and the day's work is well and truly done. Rest now by the mouth of the river, where the world once came to shore. Sleep well. Tonight, let us travel together along the great works of stone that bound an empire together, the roads that ran straight across the world and the high arched channels that carried rivers through the air. We will follow them slowly in the soft light of evening, in no hurry to arrive anywhere at all. There's nothing here you need to build or maintain, no journey you must make. You can let the words flow over you like water moving gently along a channel, and let yourself drift slowly down towards sleep. This is the story of the roads and the aqueducts of Rome. Picture, if you will, the Empire of Rome at its height, a single state stretching across the whole of the known world, holding within its borders many millions of people, hundreds of cities, peoples of every kind and tongue. To rule such a world, to move armies and messengers and goods across it, to keep its distant parts in touch with the center, Rome needed something the world had never had before, a network of communication, a web of roads reaching out from the capital to every province and frontier. And so the Romans built roads. They built them better and more durably than anyone before them, and so well that some of them are still in use today, 2,000 years later, beneath the asphalt of modern highways that follow the very lines the Romans laid. There was a saying in the old world that all roads lead to Rome, and it was nearly true, for the great trunk roads of the empire radiated out from the capital like the spokes of a wheel, running to the edges of the Roman world. In the very heart of the city stood a gilded marker, a golden milestone, from which the distances along all the roads were measured, the symbolic center of the whole vast network. From it the roads ran out, north and south and east and west, over the mountains and across the plains, through forests and deserts, to the farthest frontiers of the empire. Let us speak of how they built them, for the building of a Roman road was a thing of patience and craft, and it is soothing to consider the careful, layered work of it. A Roman road was not merely a track worn into the earth. It was a built thing, an engineered structure, raised in layers like a great long foundation. First, the road builders dug a trench along the line of the road, marking it out straight and true. Into the bottom they laid a foundation of large stones, packed firm. Over this they spread a layer of smaller stones and gravel, bound together, and over that perhaps a layer of sand or finer material, each layer pressed down and leveled. And on top, for the finest roads, they laid the surface. Great flat paving stones fitted closely together, slightly raised in the center and sloping gently to each side so that the rain would run off into ditches dug along the edges. The whole structure might be several feet thick, a deep and solid bed of stone that would not sink into the mud or wash away in the rains, that would carry the tramp of marching legions and the grind of cartwheels for centuries without failing. And the Romans built their roads straight. This was their famous habit, and it tells us something about the Roman mind. Where the land allowed, a Roman road did not wander or curve to follow the easy way. It ran straight as an arrow toward its destination, climbing the hills rather than going around them, cutting through obstacles, holding its line with a stubborn directness that still impresses us. The Roman surveyors, with their simple but clever instruments, sighted long straight lines across the country, from high point to high point, and the road builders followed them. And so the roads ran arrow straight across the landscape, mile after mile, in a way that no road had run before, and few would run again until modern times. Along these roads, at regular intervals, stood milestones, tall stone pillars that marked the distance, and often recorded the name of the emperor who had built or repaired that stretch. And at intervals stood way stations and posting houses, where the official messengers of the empire could change horses and rest, for Rome maintained a great courier service, a relay of riders and fast carriages that could carry an urgent message across the empire with remarkable speed, passing it from station to station along the roads. A message could travel from the frontier to the capital in days rather than weeks, and this swift communication was one of the things that held the sprawling empire together, that allowed the center to know what happened at the edges and to respond. The roads carried everything. They carried the legions, marching out to the frontiers or hurrying to where they were needed, for a road that could move an army quickly was worth more than many fortresses. They carried the merchants and their goods, the trade that flowed along the arteries of the empire. They carried the travelers, the officials and the pilgrims, and the ordinary people going about their journeys, staying at the inns along the way. And they carried ideas and letters and news, knitting the far-flung provinces into a single connected world. For as long as the roads were kept, the empire was one thing, joined together. And when at last, in the long decline, the roads fell into disrepair and grew dangerous and were no longer mended, the world itself began to fall apart into separate pieces, no longer able to reach across the distances. The roads were the empire's nerves and veins, and their long durability is one of the great achievements of Roman hands. Let us imagine for a while what it was like to travel one of these roads, for the experience of a journey in the Roman world was shaped entirely by them, and it is a pleasant thing to picture as the evening settles. Suppose you were a traveler in the days of the empire, setting out from Rome along one of the great roads. You would pass first through the tombs that line the road just outside the city, for the Romans buried their dead along the roadsides, so that the traveler leaving the city walked at first between the monuments of the departed, reading their names and their epitaphs as he went. Then the country would open out, and the road would run on ahead, straight and paved and sure, and you would settle into the rhythm of the journey. If you were poor, you walked, covering perhaps 20 miles in a day. If you were better off, you might ride or travel in a carriage or be carried in a litter. Along the way you would pass others on the same road, merchants with their pack animals and wagons, soldiers marching in column, officials hurrying on the business of the state, pilgrims, wanderers, slaves, the whole moving life of the empire flowing along its stone arteries. And as evening came, you would look for an inn, for the roads were lined with them, places where a traveler could find a bed, a meal, a cup of wine, and stabling for his animals. Some were rough and disreputable, the haunt of thieves and worse, and the traveler had to choose with care. Others were comfortable enough. And for the official traveler, the messenger or the magistrate on the business of the state, there were the posting houses, the way stations of the imperial service, where fresh horses waited and better lodging could be had. Mile by mile, day by day, the road carried you across the empire, through provinces and past cities, over rivers on great stone bridges, always sure beneath your feet, always leading on toward your destination. It was a thing the world had never known before, this ability to travel safely and surely across thousands of miles under a single law and along a single network of roads, and it would not be known again for many centuries after Rome was gone. Now let us turn from the roads that carried people to the channels that carried water, for the aqueducts of Rome were a marvel as great, and in their way even more wonderful. A great city needs water, an enormous amount of it, far more than its own wells and the river running through it can provide. The city of Rome, swollen to nearly 1 million people, was desperately thirsty, and the Tiber that ran through it was too dirty to drink. And so the Romans brought water to their city from far away, from springs and lakes in the hills and mountains many miles distant, and they brought it through channels of their own making, the aqueducts, some of the most beautiful and ingenious structures the ancient world produced. Let us understand how an aqueduct worked, for the principle behind it is simple and elegant, and there is a quiet pleasure in grasping it. An aqueduct carried water by the gentle pull of gravity alone. The Romans found a source of clean water, a spring or a lake in the hills at a height greater than the city, and from it they built a channel, a covered conduit that ran all the way to Rome, sloping very gently downward the whole way, so that the water flowed steadily along it, always running slightly downhill mile after mile until it reached the city. There were no pumps, no machines, only the patient pull of gravity carrying the water along its long descending path. The difficulty and the genius lay in maintaining that gentle slope across the broken landscape, over many miles of hill and valley. The channel had to fall, but only a little, only enough to keep the water flowing, never so steep that the water rushed too fast, never level enough that it stood still. To hold this delicate slope across the country, the Roman engineers used every device they knew. Where the land was high, they tunneled through it, boring the channel straight through the hills. Where the land was low, where a valley dropped away beneath the line the water had to follow, they raised the channel up on arches, building those great rows of stone arches striding across the valleys that are the very image of Roman engineering, carrying the water channel high in the air, level and true, across the low ground. The water ran along the top, hidden in its covered conduit, while beneath it marched the arches, rank upon rank, sometimes in 2 or 3 tiers stacked one upon another to reach the necessary height. a river flowing through the sky on legs of stone. Let us pause and marvel for a moment at the precision this demanded, for it is easy to say that the channel sloped gently downhill, but to achieve that gentle, unbroken slope across many miles of wild country without modern instruments was a feat of surveying that still astonishes those who study it. Over the whole long course of an aqueduct, the fall might be only a tiny fraction of its length, a drop of a few feet over the span of a mile, so slight that the eye could scarcely detect it. Yet it had to be held true the entire way, never reversing, never falling too steeply across hills and valleys and broken ground, by men working with little more than sighting rods and water levels and plumb lines in an immense and careful patience. They would survey the line again and again, checking and rechecking, adjusting the path of the channel to keep its slope just so, tunneling where they must and bridging where they must, all to preserve that delicate, unbroken descent. That they succeeded again and again across the whole empire, building aqueducts many miles long that delivered their water faithfully for centuries, is one of the quiet wonders of the ancient world, a triumph not of brute force but of patient, exacting skill. These aqueduct bridges are among the most beautiful things the Romans ever built, and some of them still stand, astonishing in their height and their grace, the great arches marching across the valleys of Spain and France and Italy, as sound today as when they were raised. To see one is to understand at a glance the confidence and the skill of the Roman builders, who could throw a river across a valley on arches of stone and trust it to stand for 2,000 years. And the water they brought transformed the city. Imagine Rome before the aqueducts, a city dependent on its wells and its muddy river. And then imagine Rome at its height, with a dozen great aqueducts pouring clean water into it day and night, hundreds of millions of gallons, more water per person than many cities enjoy even today. This abundance of water made possible the whole splendor of Roman urban life. It fed the public fountains that stood at the street corners, from which the ordinary people drew their drinking water, fountains that ran continuously, the overflow washing the streets clean. It fed the great public baths, those vast and luxurious establishments where the people of Rome bathed and gathered with their pools of hot and warm and cold water, their steam rooms, their endless flowing water. It fed the homes of the wealthy and the gardens and the latrines that were flushed by running water carrying the waste away into the great sewers beneath the city. The aqueducts made Rome not only a great city, but a clean and healthy and pleasant one, by the standards of the ancient world, a city of fountains and baths and running water, and this was one of the truest measures of Roman civilization. When the water reached the city, it flowed into great distribution tanks, from which it was divided and sent out through a network of pipes, mostly of lead, running beneath the streets to the fountains and baths and houses. Officials oversaw the whole system, the maintenance of the channels, the cleaning of the tanks, the fair division of the water, the catching of those who tapped the pipes illegally to steal water for themselves. It was a great public work, maintained at public expense for the public good, and the Romans were rightly proud of it. One of the men who oversaw the water supply of Rome wrote a whole book about the aqueducts, describing them with evident pride, and he compared them favorably with the idol pyramids and the famous but useless monuments of other lands. For these, he said, were structures that actually served the people, that brought life and health to a great city, and what monument could be nobler than that? Let us linger a moment on the great baths that the aqueducts made possible, for they were among the wonders of Rome, and to imagine them is to feel the abundance that the flowing water brought. The largest of the imperial baths were not mere bathhouses, but vast palaces of leisure, covering many acres, able to hold thousands of bathers at once. A visitor would pass through grand halls roofed with soaring vaults, their walls sheathed in colored marble, their floors patterned with mosaic, their niches filled with statues. There were great pools of water, hot and warm and cold, and steam rooms and dry heat rooms, and courtyards for exercise, and gardens and libraries, and spaces simply for sitting and talking. The water flowed endlessly, fed by the aqueducts, heated by furnaces that an army of slaves kept burning beneath the floors. And all of this magnificence was open to the ordinary people of Rome for a tiny fee, or for nothing at all on the days when a generous emperor threw the baths open free. The humblest citizen could spend his afternoon amid marble and mosaic and flowing water, in a luxury that kings of earlier ages could scarcely have imagined. It was one of the great democratic glories of Rome, this sharing out of comfort and beauty among the common people, and it rested entirely upon the patient miracle of the aqueducts, the water brought faithfully from the distant hills. And think, too, of what the water carried away, for a great city must not only be supplied with clean water but rid of its waste, and here too the Romans built on a grand scale. Beneath the streets of Rome ran great sewers, channels of stone large enough in places to walk or even ride through, that gathered the used water and the waste of the city and carried it down to the river and away. The oldest of these had been built in the very earliest days of the city, to drain the marshy ground between the hills, and it was enlarged and extended over the centuries until a whole hidden river ran beneath the city, washing it clean. The constant overflow of the fountains and the baths, water that never stopped flowing, ran down into these sewers and kept them scoured and moving. And so the water made its whole journey through the life of the city, down from the hills along the aqueducts into the tanks and pipes, out through the fountains and baths and houses, and then down into the sewers and back to the river and the sea, a great circulation of water that kept the vast city alive and clean. It was a system of a sophistication that would not be matched again in Europe for more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. There is something in that thought worth carrying towards sleep, that the truest greatness of Rome lay not only in its conquests and its emperors and its games, but in these patient, useful works, the roads that joined the world and the channels that watered the cities, built not for glory but for use, and lasting, because of that, longer than the glory. Long after the legions were gone and the emperors forgotten, the roads still carried travelers and the aqueducts still poured their water, the quiet, enduring gifts of a civilization to the ages that came after. Let us follow the water now one last time in the soft light of evening, along its long, gentle descent from the hills. It rises far away among the cool springs of the mountains, clear and cold, and gathers into the channel and begins its slow journey down. It flows through the tunnels in the dark heart of the hills and out across the valleys high on its arches, level and unhurried, falling only a little with each mile, patient as time itself. It runs through the long evening and into the night while the country sleeps below, and on toward the great city, where the fountains murmur in the dark squares and the baths lie quiet and the people sleep in their beds, and the water comes to them faithfully through the night, as it has every night for hundreds of years, asking nothing, simply flowing gently downhill toward the sleeping city. You can let yourself flow with it now, slow and gentle and downhill all the way, carried easily along, with nothing to do but follow the soft, descending current toward rest. The roads are quiet under the stars. The water murmurs in the channels. The great works of stone keep their patient watch and need nothing from you at all. Rest now, carried gently downhill toward the deep, still water of sleep. Sleep well. Tonight, let us travel together to the long, slow evening of a great empire, to the centuries in which the vast and ancient power of Rome in the West gently faded, not in a single moment of catastrophe, but over long years, the way a long day fades at last into dusk. We will move through it slowly and without sorrow, in the soft, failing light, and no hurry at all. There is nothing here you must hold on to, no fall you must prevent. You can let the words settle over you like the quiet of a darkening sky, and let yourself drift gently down toward sleep. This is the story of the fall of the Roman West. Picture, if you will, the Empire of Rome some centuries after the great peace of Augustus, after the height of its glory had passed. It was still vast, still powerful, still the greatest state in its world. But it had begun to change, slowly and then more quickly, in ways that those living through them did not always notice, the way one does not notice the lengthening of the shadows on a long afternoon until quite suddenly the evening has come. Let us speak first gently of why so great a thing should fade, for it is one of the questions that has fascinated thoughtful people ever since, and there is no single answer to it, but rather many causes woven together, like the many threads of a fraying rope. The empire had grown enormous, and enormous things are hard to hold together. For centuries Rome had expanded, conquering and absorbing, but an empire cannot expand forever, and when the conquering stopped, so too did the flow of plunder and captives and new wealth that had fed the Roman state. The empire had now to live within its means, to defend its long frontiers without the riches of fresh conquest, and this strained it. Its borders were immense, thousands of miles of frontier along rivers and deserts and forests, and beyond those frontiers pressed many peoples, hungry for the warmth and wealth of the Roman lands, and the legions, stretched thin along all that vast perimeter, found it ever harder to hold every part of it at once. Within, too, there were troubles. The smooth succession of emperors that Augustus had hoped to establish often broke down into struggle and civil war, as ambitious generals turned their armies against one another to seize the throne, so that there were long periods when emperor followed emperor in quick and bloody succession, each raised up by his soldiers and soon cast down by another. These civil wars drained the empire's strength and turned its armies inward upon itself when they were most needed at the frontiers. The cost of the great army and the sprawling government grew heavy, and the taxes that paid for them pressed hard upon the people, and the coinage was debased, and trade suffered, and the cities, those jewels of Roman civilization, began slowly to shrink. Let us dwell a little longer on these woven causes, gently, for they are worth understanding, and there is a kind of calm in tracing how a great thing slowly changes. Some have pointed to the land itself and to the people who worked it, for the prosperity of Rome had always rested upon its farms, and in the later centuries the small free farmers who had once been the backbone of the state grew fewer, their lands swallowed into great estates worked by tied laborers and slaves, and as the free peasantry declined, so too did the pool of sturdy citizen soldiers and taxpayers upon which the empire had been built. Others have pointed to the climate and to sickness, for there is evidence that in these later centuries the weather grew harsher and less kind to the harvests, and that terrible plague swept through the crowded empire, carried along its very roads and sea lanes, killing great numbers and leaving the fields untended and the armies thinned. Others have looked to the slow changes in the spirit of the age, the way the old confident civic pride of the Roman, the eagerness to serve the state and to glory in its greatness, gradually gave way to other concerns, more private, more inward, more turned toward the next world than this one. And there is truth in all of these, and in none of them alone, for the fading of Rome was not the work of any single cause, but of many causes acting together over many generations, each one small in itself, each one easy to overlook, but together enough in the end to wear away even so mighty a thing as the empire of Rome. This is the way of most great changes in the world. They do not come as a single blow, but as a slow accumulation, a gathering of small weights, a wearing away too gradual to see from within. The people who lived through the long decline did not know they were living through a decline at all. They thought they were simply living, in years a little harder than their fathers' years, under taxes a little heavier, behind frontiers a little less secure, and only when one stood far back across the long centuries could the whole great shape of the change be seen. To govern so vast a realm, the empire was at last divided, formally split into two halves, an eastern half and a western half, each with its own ruler and its own capital, for one man could no longer manage the whole. This was a wise and practical arrangement, and it allowed the empire to be defended more effectively for a time. But it also meant that the two halves drifted gradually apart and their fortunes diverged. The eastern half, with its great wealthy cities and its rich provinces, its strong new capital guarding the crossroads of Europe and Asia, would prove the stronger, and it would endure, in fact, for another 1,000 years, long after the West had faded. But the western half, poorer and more exposed, bearing the brunt of the pressure on the northern frontiers, would be the one to fall. Now let us speak of that pressure on the frontiers, for it was the immediate cause of the Western Empire's end. Beyond the rivers that marked the northern border lived many peoples whom the Romans called by the general name of barbarians, a great patchwork of tribes and confederations, farmers and warriors who had long lived in the shadow of Rome, sometimes trading with it, sometimes raiding it, sometimes serving in its armies. For centuries, the frontier had held them back. But now, under pressures of their own, including the arrival from the far east of fierce nomad horsemen who drove other peoples before them, these tribes began to move, whole peoples on the march, men and women and children and herds, seeking new lands to settle, pressing against the Roman border and at last pouring across it. This was not, for the most part, a sudden violent invasion of the kind we might imagine, though there was violence in it. It was more a great slow migration, a movement of peoples into the failing empire, sometimes by force, sometimes by agreement, as the Roman state, no longer strong enough to keep them out, tried instead to settle them within its borders, to give them land, and to use their warriors in its own armies. More and more of the empire's own soldiers came to be drawn from these very peoples, until the line between Roman and barbarian grew blurred, and the armies that defended Rome were led and manned by men whose grandfathers had lived beyond its frontiers. For a time this worked after a fashion, but the balance was delicate and it tipped at last. There came a day, deep in this long evening, when a host of these peoples came to the very gates of Rome itself, the ancient capital, the eternal city that had not seen a foreign enemy within its walls for some 800 years. And the city was taken, and for some days it was plundered. The actual harm done was not, by the standards of such things, very great. The attackers were themselves in part Romanized and Christian, and they spared much, and after a few days they departed. But the shock of it rang through the whole Roman world and far beyond. Rome, the unconquerable, the eternal, had fallen to a foreign army. To people across the empire, it seemed as though the very order of the world had cracked. If Rome could fall, what was safe? Thoughtful men wrote of it with grief and bewilderment, struggling to understand how such a thing could be. After that, the decline of the West came on more swiftly. The western provinces, one by one, slipped from the control of the central government, as various peoples settled in them and set up kingdoms of their own, sometimes in the name of Rome, acknowledging its authority in form while ruling in fact for themselves, and sometimes simply taking the land outright. The rich province of Africa, which fed the city with its grain, was lost. The provinces of the far west and north went their own ways. The actual territory ruled from the old capital shrank and shrank, until the Western emperors governed little more than Italy itself, and then less even than that. And the Western emperors themselves became, in these last years, shadows of what they had been, often young men or weak men, puppets in the hands of their generals, many of whom were themselves of barbarian origin. The real power lay with these military commanders, who made and unmade emperors at will, while the empire crumbled around them. The whole vast machinery of the Roman state, the legions, the taxes, the administration, the very idea of a single empire ruling the West was wearing away, thread by thread. And at last it simply ended, so quietly that the men of the time scarcely marked it as an ending at all. There came a year when the last emperor to rule in the West, a boy with, as it happened, the names of both the legendary founder of Rome and its first great emperor, was gently set aside by the barbarian general who commanded the army of Italy. The general did not even trouble to name a new Western emperor in his place. He simply sent the imperial regalia, the symbols of the Western throne, to the emperor in the East, and declared that one emperor in the East was enough for the whole Roman world. And so, without a great battle, without a final catastrophe, the line of emperors in the West came quietly to its end, and the Western Roman Empire, which had endured for 500 years, was simply no more. It is one of the gentle ironies of history that this great ending, which we mark so heavily, passed almost unnoticed at the time. For most ordinary people in the Western lands, life went on much as before. They still farmed their fields and lived in their villages and worshipped their god. The new kings who ruled them often kept the Roman laws and the Roman administration and the Roman language, for they admired Rome and wished to inherit its prestige, not to destroy it. The cities shrank and the great public works decayed, and the long-distance trade dwindled and learning grew dimmer, and life became in many ways smaller and harder and more local. But Rome did not vanish, it faded. It dissolved slowly into the new world that was forming, leaving its language and its law and its roads and its memory woven deep into everything that came after. For this is perhaps the truest thing to say about the fall of Rome, that it was less a death than a long transformation, a passing of one age into another, so gradual that no one could point to the moment it occurred. The empire in the West did not so much fall as fade, settling slowly into the landscape of a new age, the way the great buildings settled into ruin, still standing, still magnificent, but no longer what they had been. And in the East, all the while, the other half of the empire lived on, calling itself Roman still, keeping the old name and the old claim for another 1,000 years, so that in a sense Rome did not truly fall for a very long time indeed. Let us pause and think a little more about that endurance, about all the ways in which Rome outlived its own ending, for it is a comforting thought to carry towards sleep, that nothing truly great is ever wholly lost. Consider the language. The everyday speech of the Roman people, carried to every province by the soldiers and the settlers and the merchants, took root in the lands of the West and grew there, changing slowly over the centuries, branching and softening, until it became the family of tongues that hundreds of millions speak today across 2 continents, each one a living descendant of the language once spoken in the streets of Rome. When a child in a distant land speaks its mother tongue, it speaks, without knowing it, a late and altered form of the speech of the Caesars. Rome lives on in every such word. Consider the law. The Romans were, above all things, a people of law, patient builders of a great structure of rules and principles for the ordering of human affairs, and over many centuries their finest minds labored to refine it, to make it just and clear and reasonable. And when the empire faded, this great body of law did not perish with it. It was gathered and preserved and studied, and in later ages it was taken up again, and it became the foundation upon which much of the law of the modern world is built, so that even now, in courts and parliaments far from Rome, men reason in ways the Roman jurists taught them. Consider the very shape of our buildings, the arches and the domes and the columns, the patterns of grand architecture that we still reach for when we wish to build something noble. Consider the calendar that orders our year, the names of our months, the letters in which we write. In 1,000 quiet ways, woven so deep into our world that we no longer see them, the gifts of Rome are with us still, the legacy of a city that has been gone in its old form for 1,500 years, and yet has never truly left us at all. And Rome never truly died at all, if we look closely. Its language became the parent of the languages that many millions speak today. Its law became the foundation of the law of much of the world. Its roads ran on beneath later roads, and its arches still stand, and its very name became a word for grandeur and order and civilization itself. The city on the 7 hills, which began as the home of a herdsman and grew to rule the world, gave to all the ages that followed a memory and a model that has never faded. An idea of what a great and ordered human society might be, that men have looked back to and longed for and tried to recreate for 1,500 years and more. There is a thought here worth resting in as the light grows dim, a thought that takes much of the sorrow out of the word fall. We speak of the fall of Rome as though it were a tragedy, a catastrophe, a great light suddenly put out, but that is not really how it was. Nothing was suddenly put out. The thing we call Rome had been, for all its glory, only one particular arrangement of the world, one way of ordering the lives of the millions who lived within it. And when that arrangement at last wore out and gave way, the people did not vanish, and the land did not empty, and the knowledge and the memory and the achievements did not disappear. They simply passed into new hands and new forms. The old order ended, and a new order slowly, painfully, over many generations, took its place, an order that carried within it, like seeds in the soil, all the inheritance of Rome, waiting to grow again in new seasons. What looks from close up like an ending, looks from far enough away like a turning, a passage, a handing on. And perhaps that is the gentlest and the truest way to think of all great endings, even the ones that touch us nearer than the fall of a distant empire. Nothing that has truly mattered is ever wholly lost. It changes its form, it passes into other things, it lives on in what comes after, carried forward in ways we cannot always see. The Romans themselves, in their wisest moods, understood this. They knew that all things pass, that even the mightiest works of men are borrowed for a while from time and must one day be returned, and they faced this knowledge at their best, not with despair but with a kind of calm. Build well, they seem to say, live well, do your work in your own day as nobly as you can, and let the long centuries do with it what they will. It is not a sad philosophy, it is a restful one, and it suits the quiet of this hour as the long day of Rome comes to its close. So let us not mourn the fall of Rome tonight, but rather watch it gently, the way one watches a long and beautiful day come at last to its close. The light is failing now over the 7 hills, soft and golden, the long shadows stretching across the old forum where the orators once spoke, across the empty Colosseum, along the straight roads running out to the silent frontiers, the fountains still murmur in the dusk. The river moves on, slow and patient, as it has through all the ages, through the founding and the glory and the fading, untroubled by any of it, flowing on toward the sea. The great work is finished now. The empire has done its long labor across the centuries and earned its long rest and is settling, gently and without pain, into the deep quiet of the past. There is nothing left to do, nothing to hold up, nothing to defend. The watch is ended, the day is over, and all the noise and glory of 1,000 years is sinking softly into stillness, like a city settling into sleep beneath the first stars. You can let it all settle now, and settle with it down through the soft gold light into the deep and gentle dark. The story is told, from the wolf upon the riverbank to the last quiet evening of the empire, and there is no more to tell, and nothing more to do but rest. Rest now beneath the eternal stars over the 7 hills, where it all began, and where in the end it all gently came to rest. Sleep well.